There's something strange preserved in the oldest libraries we've ever discovered. Clay tablets, thousands of them, pressed with wedge-shaped marks 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. When scholars finally learned to read them in the 1800s, they found stories about gods, but not the kind you might expect. These were stories of gods who fought each other, gods who took opposing sides, gods who competed and disputed and, according to these texts, went to war. The Anunnaki, the great divine assembly that was supposed to govern the cosmos in harmony, tore itself apart, and the tablets tell us why. Hello, I'm so glad you're here. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe you're winding down after a long day. Maybe your mind's been busy and you're ready for it to settle somewhere interesting. This is a good place for that. We're going to spend the next few hours with something genuinely fascinating. What these 5,000-year-old texts actually say about conflicts between the gods themselves. And here's what makes it interesting. These aren't vague myths. They're specific. They name which gods disagreed. They explain what each one wanted. They describe disputes in the divine assembly. They catalog the consequences. It's remarkably detailed, almost like reading ancient court records, except the court is cosmic. Why would gods fight? These beings supposedly created humanity together. They divided up the universe peacefully at first. They established a governmental system, councils, votes, shared authority. So what went wrong? What made brothers end up on opposite sides? What caused rebellions among lesser gods? What turned this system into competing factions? The tablets give us answers, specific answers. Scholars debate what they mean. Some think it's metaphor, divine conflicts representing human cities at war. When Lagash fought their gods fought in the myths. That makes sense. But others wonder if there's something more here. Echoes of real catastrophes. Events so massive that ancient people could only explain them as wars between the powers that shaped their world. We're not here to settle that debate. Both readings are interesting. We're here to explore what the tablets actually say, to look at these stories together, to wonder about them. Take a breath. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you comfortable? Good. We've got time. Plenty of time. If this kind of exploration helps you, a like or subscribe would help others find it too. Thank you. So here's where we're headed. Ancient Sumer, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. Iraq today, but 5,000 years ago, it was where cities first rose. Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu. In those cities, in temple libraries, scribes pressed reeds into soft clay, recording what they believed were essential truths about how the divine order worked and how it fell apart. The Anunnaki, 50 great gods forming a divine assembly. Enlil ruled earth and storms. Enki governed the waters below and presided from heaven. Inanna claimed both love and war. Below them, 300 lesser gods called the Igigi, doing all the hard work, digging canals, managing rivers, maintaining creation. The system was designed for balance, for consensus, for shared governance. But it didn't work out that way. The tablets describe something else, deep disagreements that couldn't be bridged. Enlil and Enki, brothers, on opposite sides of every major decision. Lesser gods refusing to keep laboring. Territorial disputes as gods competed for cities, offerings, prestige. Younger gods challenging ancient authority. The assembly reaching deadlock. Democracy breaking down. And consequences. Weapons deployed. Cities destroyed. Populations caught between competing gods. Even the famous flood, when you read it carefully, isn't about punishing human sin. It's about one God's solution that another God refused to accept. We're going to walk through this slowly, through the early days when things worked, through geographic divisions that created competition, through the hierarchy that bred resentment, through specific conflicts, rebellions, disputes, through texts describing war in heaven. If you know Sumerian mythology, some of this might sound familiar, but we're looking at it differently tonight. Not gods and humans, gods and gods. What happens when cosmic authority fractures? Why beings who should have maintained order couldn't. The stars above you now, those are the same stars the Sumerians watched. They called Venus Inanna. The moon was Nana. Jupiter became Marduk. And under those unchanging stars, in temples lit by oil lamps, scribes preserved these stories of conflict in heaven. Why did the Anunnaki turn against each other? The tablets tell us, with names, reasons, consequences. Whether we read it as mythology or memory, the stories survived. 5,000 years, still speaking, still making us wonder. Let's start at the beginning, before the conflicts, before the fractures, back when the Anunnaki first divided everything up. We need to see what that system looked like before we can understand how it came apart. Long before any god was named, long before any priest climbed a ziggurat to watch the stars, long before anyone pressed a reed into clay to write the first word, there was just the land, the rivers, the sky, and silence. We need to go back, way back, not to the beginning of cities, or writing, or even agriculture, back to when the world itself was still settling into the shape that would one day cradle civilization. Back 12,000 years, 15,000, to a time when the planet was just emerging from the last ice age, when glaciers that had covered half the northern hemisphere were melting, sending unimaginable volumes of water toward the seas. The Persian Gulf didn't exist as we know it. Not yet. During the Ice Age, when so much water was locked in ice sheets miles thick, sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. 300 feet. The Gulf was a river valley, a green corridor where the Tigris and Euphrates flowed together and continued south for hundreds of miles through land that's now underwater. Dry land, huntable land, livable land. But the ice was melting, and the water was rising, not in a day, not in a year, but over generations, over centuries. The sea crept northward. Imagine standing on that ancient coast. Perhaps your grandfather told you the water was farther out when he was young. Your father showed you stones he placed at the waterline as a boy, now submerged. And you see it too, the marsh growing, the land shrinking, the world changing faster than anyone can remember it changing before. This is the world being born, the world that will become Mesopotamia, the world where the stories of the Anunnaki will eventually be written down. But that's still 8,000 years away. Right now, there are no cities, no temples, no gods with names, just people moving across a landscape in transformation. The climate is changing too, as the ice retreats northward, as the world warms, weather patterns shift. The region that was cold and dry during the glacial maximum becomes warmer, more rain falls. The storms that sweep across from the Mediterranean bring water now instead of just cold wind. Grasses spread. Trees find purchase along the riverbanks. Animals follow the green, and humans follow the animals. Perhaps, on clear nights, small groups of hunter-gatherers camped by those ancient rivers and looked up at the stars. The same stars we see tonight. The same constellations wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. They had no way to write down what they saw, no cities to contain them, but they had eyes, they had wonder, they noticed patterns, they watched Venus rise before dawn, brilliant and steady. They tracked the moon through its phases. They told stories to explain what they saw, but those stories are lost, gone, vanished into time without a trace. We'll never know what those people believed about the lights in the sky, what names they gave the bright wandering stars, what they thought the moon was doing up there, growing fat and then thin again. All of that knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of observation, disappeared when the last person who knew it died without passing it on. By 10,000 years ago, the sea has pushed far inland. The southern tip of what will become Sumer is mostly marsh and shallow water. The Persian Gulf has filled its basin. The coastline has moved 200 miles north from where it was. Entire valleys have drowned. Hills have become islands. The world those earlier people knew, the dry Gulf corridor, is gone, underwater, and the memory of it will fade, though perhaps not entirely. Perhaps some echo of it will survive in stories, passed down, distorted over thousands of years, eventually written down as tales of a world before a great flood. We don't know, can't know, but it's interesting to wonder about. The Sumerians will write about a flood that divided time, an age before and an age after. And geologically, that's not wrong. There was an age before the seas rose, and an age after. The people who lived through the transition, who watched the water swallow the old lands, they would have known, they would have told their children, and maybe, just maybe, some fragment of that memory survived. The landscape that emerges from this transformation is unlike anywhere else on Earth. Not quite land, not quite water. The Tigris and Euphrates slow as they approach the Gulf, spreading out, dropping their sediment, building up the delta even as the sea pushes north. Between the rivers, vast marshes, reeds growing 15 feet tall, channels of open water winding through them, islands of slightly higher ground where the floods don't quite reach. It's not an easy place to live, but it's incredibly rich. Fish thrive in the warm, shallow waters. Waterfowl nest by the thousands in the reeds. The seasonal floods, when the snow melts in the mountains far to the north and the rivers swell, bring silt that enriches the soil. If you can manage the water, if you can dig channels and build levees, if you can work with the rivers instead of against them, this place will grow almost anything. By 8,000 years ago, people are beginning to figure this out. Small, permanent settlements appear, not just seasonal camps anymore. Actual houses, built to last, built to stay. The Ubaid culture, named after the archaeological site where it was first recognized. These are the first people to really commit to this difficult, waterlogged, incredibly productive environment. They're not yet writing anything down, not yet building cities, not yet worshiping gods whose names we know, but they're building the foundation, learning to live here, learning to manage the water, learning which crops grow best, developing the skills and knowledge that will, thousands of years later, support the first urban civilization. And maybe, just maybe, they're already telling stories about powers greater than themselves, about forces that control the rivers and the storms, about beings in the sky who watch over everything. We'll never know what those early stories were, but humans have always wondered, always looked for meaning, always tried to explain the world through narrative. The stars wheel overhead, patient, eternal, watching everything below. The slow transformation of the land, the rising seas, the changing climate, the first permanent settlements taking root, and eventually, much later, the first cities rising, the first temples, the first attempts to capture thought itself by pressing reeds into clay. But we're not there yet. First, we need to understand this landscape, this difficult, rich, transforming environment, because the geography matters. The division of the land will create the division of divine power. The cities that rise in different locations will claim different gods, and those gods, competing for cities, for offerings, for prestige, will eventually turn against each other. The stage is being set, the world is taking shape, and the forces that will one day be called the Anunnaki, the divine assembly, they're waiting in the future, waiting to be named, waiting to be given form in stories, waiting to conflict. When the first permanent houses were built in southern Mesopotamia, when people stopped moving with the seasons and started putting down roots, they made a choice that would echo through thousands of years. They chose where to settle, and that choice, repeated across generations, would eventually determine which gods ruled where. The land between the rivers is not uniform, not one single environment. It's a patchwork, a mosaic of different conditions. And understanding that geography, understanding why certain places became certain cities, helps us understand why the divine world later fractured along the same lines. Eridu. Let's start there. It's the oldest. At least, the Sumerians themselves said it was the oldest. The king list claims kingship first descended from heaven at Eridu. Archaeological evidence supports this, more or less. The site shows occupation going back to around 5400 BCE, 7,500 years ago. And what made Eridu special, what made people choose to settle there first, was water. Not river water, not marsh water. Fresh water welling up from underground. A spring. In a region where managing water was everything. Where too much water or too little water could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. Finding a reliable source of clean, fresh water was finding paradise. The Sumerians would later say, Enki lived in the Abzu, the underground sweet water, and Eridu was Enki's city. The connection wasn't arbitrary. It was rooted in the physical reality of the place. Imagine standing there 7,000 years ago. The marsh stretches in every direction. Reeds whisper in the wind. Water birds call. The air smells of wet earth and growing things. And right here, at this spot, clear sweet water bubbles up from below. Reliable, constant, even when the rivers are low, even when drought grips the land. This spring flows. Of course you'd build here. Of course you'd stay. Of course this place would feel sacred. Move north, 40 miles upstream. The land rises slightly. Not much, maybe 20 feet. But in this flat landscape, 20 feet matters. It's above the worst of the flooding, and it's at a point where the Euphrates, splitting into multiple channels, creates natural irrigation possibilities. This is Ur. It will become one of the greatest cities in Sumer, and its patron god will be Nana. The moon. Why the moon? Perhaps because from the high ground of the ziggurat that will eventually be built here, the moon rising over the flat marsh horizon is breathtaking. Perhaps because the lunar calendar governs the floods, and the floods govern everything. Perhaps for reasons we'll never fully understand. Further north, still. Uruk. This site is different. It's where multiple waterways converge. Trade routes meet here. goods flowing down from the north, resources coming up from the south. They all pass through Uruk. It's a natural hub, a natural center of power, and Uruk belongs to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Love and war, commerce and conflict. Perhaps that contradiction reflects Uruk's position, a place of trade, but also a place where different groups meet, compete, clash. Nippur sits almost exactly in the middle, between the northernmost Sumerian cities and the southernmost, between the Tigris and Euphrates, central, neutral. And Nippur belongs to Enlil, the king of the gods, the lord of the storm. The assembly of the gods meets at Nippur. Decisions affecting all of Sumer are made there. It's neutral ground. No single city-state controls it. Everyone respects it. Everyone brings offerings, because Enlil at Nippur holds ultimate authority. Or at least, that's the theory. That's how it's supposed to work. But the geography creates competition. Each city occupies different land, controls different resources. Ur has access to the Gulf, to maritime trade. Uruk sits at the crossroads of river commerce. Lagash controls the best agricultural land. Umma controls water flow that Lagash depends on. These aren't just political divisions. They're environmental realities. And environmental realities create conflict. When Lagash and Umma go to war in 2500 BCE, when they fight for generations over a strip of land and the water rights it controls, it's not abstract. It's survival. Crops need water. People need crops. Control the water. Control life itself. And when Lagash fights Umma, their gods fight too. Ningirsu, Lagash's patron, battles Shara, Umma's god. The divine and earthly conflicts mirror each other perfectly. Perhaps this is just how humans make sense of war, by projecting it onto cosmic scale, by claiming divine authorization. It's easier to fight if you believe your God supports you, demands it even. But perhaps there's something else here too. Perhaps the geography itself, the way the land divides into separate centers of power, each with different advantages, different vulnerabilities, different interests. Perhaps that division inevitably creates conflict, on earth and in heaven. The stars above don't show these divisions. From up there, if you could look down, you'd see one landscape, one river system, one human population. But down here, on the ground, every 20 miles is a different world, a different city, a different god, a different set of loyalties. And the thing is, these cities need each other. They trade, they intermarry, they share water systems, they worship in each other's temples sometimes. They're connected, part of one civilization, one culture, one language, but they're also separate, competing, each claiming its god is supreme, each building its ziggurat higher, each wanting to be first. The system the Sumerians develop tries to manage this, the divine assembly at Nippur, all the gods meeting, all the cities represented, decisions made collectively, consensus reached through debate and vote. It's sophisticated, it's wise, it should work, but geography keeps pulling against it. Lagash needs water that flows through Umma's land. Ur wants to control Gulf trade that Uruk depends on. Kish in the north wants authority over the south. Eridu, ancient Eridu, claims precedence because of age. Each city has legitimate interests, legitimate claims, and those claims can't all be satisfied simultaneously, so the conflicts begin. Small at first. Disputes, arguments, competing claims. But disputes between cities become disputes between gods. And if your god is fighting another god, if cosmic order itself is fractured, then war isn't just permitted, it's required. It's sacred duty. The geography of the land creates the geography of divine power, and the geography of divine power, with its overlaps and contradictions and competitions, creates the conditions for the conflicts we're going to explore. This landscape, these rivers, these marshes, these slightly elevated plots of ground where cities will rise, they're not neutral, they're not innocent. They're the stage on which divine drama will play out. The structure that makes conflict almost inevitable. Long before any tablet was written, the geography was already shaping what those tablets would say. There's something we need to understand about the divine world the Sumerians imagined. It wasn't egalitarian, not even close. It was intensely hierarchical, and that hierarchy, like most hierarchies, created resentment among those on the bottom, the Anunnaki, the great gods, 50 of them, according to the texts. But even among these 50, there were ranks, gradations of power, and at the top, Father of Gods, supreme but distant. Below him, Enlil, active ruler of earth. Then Enki, lord of wisdom and water. Then the next tier, Inanna, Nanna, Utu, Ninhursag, each with their domains, each with their authority, each knowing exactly where they stood in the cosmic pecking order. And below all of them, the Igigi, 300 lesser gods. And the texts are very clear about their role. They do the work, the actual physical labor of maintaining creation, digging the canals that keep water flowing to the fields, managing the rivers so they flood at the right time, maintaining the cosmic machinery that makes existence possible. Imagine being one of the Igigi. You're divine, yes, immortal, yes, but you're still expected to spend eternity digging ditches, while the great Anunnaki sit in their temples receiving offerings, being worshipped, making decisions in assembly. You do the work, they get the glory. You break your back, they rest. You maintain creation, they govern it. How long before you start to resent that? The Atrahasis epic tells us exactly how long. 40 years. That's what the text says. For 40 years, the Igigi dig. They count the years of their labor. And then, enough. They refuse. They burn their tools. They march on Enlil's temple at Nippur. They strike. This is remarkable. Think about it. The very first extended narrative we have in written human literature. One of the oldest stories ever recorded is about workers rebelling against their bosses, about lesser beings refusing to accept their subordinate position, about challenging the hierarchy itself. The great gods are terrified. The text says so explicitly. Enlil is frightened when he hears the Igigi outside his temple and comes down from heaven. The divine assembly convenes an emergency session, and they have to figure out what to do, because the system depends on the Igigi, depends on their labor. Without them, creation grinds to a halt. Enki proposes a solution: create a substitute labor force, humans, make them from clay and divine blood, program them, essentially, to do the work the Igigi refuse to do. The assembly agrees. Humanity is created, and the Igigi are freed from their toil. Problem solved, right? But look what this story reveals about the divine world. It's not harmonious. It's not unified in purpose. There are deep structural tensions. The hierarchy creates classes. Classes create resentment. Resentment creates rebellion, even in heaven, even among gods. And there's another problem the story exposes. The great gods themselves don't agree on fundamental things. When the Igigi rebel, when the emergency assembly meets, the gods have different responses. Some want to crush the rebellion, force the Igigi back to work. maintain order through power. Others, especially Enki, think that's unwise. That forcing resentful workers to labor just creates more problems. That finding a different solution is smarter. This is a philosophical divide, not about facts, but about values, about how authority should work, about whether power should be absolute or negotiated, about whether wisdom matters more than force. And this divide runs through every major story the Sumerians tell, every crisis, every decision. Enlil on one side, Enki on the other. The assembly caught between them. Perhaps this reflects something the Sumerians observed in their own society, that there are fundamentally different approaches to governance, different philosophies about how power should be wielded, and that these differences can't always be reconciled, that sometimes you have to choose, and choosing creates winners and losers, creates factions. The hierarchy itself is interesting. Why is and supreme? Because he's the sky, the ultimate source. Why is Enlil king of the gods? Because he's the storm, and storms bring both life and destruction. Why is Enki wisdom? Because he governs the underground waters, hidden, mysterious, essential but unseen. Each god's position reflects something about the natural world, about how forces relate to each other. But once you establish a hierarchy, once you say some are greater and others lesser, you create competition. Gods want to rise, want to claim higher rank, want to challenge those above them, and you create resentment in those who feel their position doesn't match their worth, who believe they deserve better, who chafe under authority they consider illegitimate. The stars above show no hierarchy. Sirius isn't greater than Vega. Orion doesn't rule Ursa Major. They're just lights, moving through their patterns, equal in their own way. But humans, when we look at stars, we create hierarchies. We choose one to be the pole star. We group them into constellations and give them ranks. We impose order, and that imposed order always creates the same tensions. The Sumerian divine hierarchy reflects human social structure. Kings over priests, over merchants, over farmers, over slaves, each level owing service to those above, each level receiving service from those below. It's how their cities worked, and they imagined the cosmos working the same way, as above, so below, or as below, so above. But here's the thing. Once you write it down, once you record the tensions and the resentments and the rebellions, you're admitting something. You're admitting the system doesn't work perfectly. That hierarchy creates problems. That even cosmic order is fragile. That authority, even divine authority, is contested. The Igigi rebellion is solved through compromise, through creating humans to do the work. But the deeper problem remains. The lesser gods still outrank humanity. But they remember being subordinate. They remember rebelling. They remember that change is possible. That authority can be challenged. And the great gods, they remember too. They remember being frightened. They remember needing Enki's cleverness to save them. They remember that their power depends on others accepting it. That if enough refuse, even gods have to adapt. This sets the stage for everything that follows, for the disputes over humanity, for the territorial competitions, for the challenges to authority, for the conflicts that will tear the assembly apart. Because once you've established that there are winners and losers, once you've created a hierarchy that some resent, once you've shown that rebellion is possible, then unity becomes very difficult to maintain. The world is taking shape. The cities are growing. The gods are being named and assigned their roles. The system is being established. But the seeds of its fracturing are already present in the geography, in the hierarchy, in the philosophical divisions between those who rule through power and those who rule through wisdom. We're not at war yet, not quite, but we're approaching the conflicts, the specific disputes, the named confrontations. And now we understand why they were almost inevitable, why gods who should have been able to govern together couldn't. The first extended narrative written in human history, one of the oldest stories we possess in any language, begins with gods digging in mud. That's remarkable when you think about it. Of all the things ancient scribes could have written down first, of all the tales they could have preserved, they chose this one, a story about divine rebellion, about workers refusing to work anymore. The Atrahasis epic, that's what scholars call it today, named after the human hero who appears later in the story. But the epic doesn't start with humanity. It starts much earlier, in a time when humans didn't exist yet, when only gods walked the earth, and when those gods, the lesser ones, were exhausted. The tablets that preserve this story date to around 1700 BCE, found at multiple sites across Mesopotamia, copies made by scribes who considered this narrative essential, worth preserving, worth teaching to students. And when you read it, when you see what it says, you understand why they thought it mattered. When the gods were man, that's how it begins, a strange phrase. But it means when the gods did the work that humans would later do, when divine beings labored. The great Anunnaki had divided the cosmos among themselves. An took heaven, Enlil took earth, Enki took the waters below. Standard creation story stuff. But then comes the detail that makes this different. The great gods assign the work of maintaining creation to the lesser gods, the Igigi, 300 of them, and the work was brutal, digging canals, managing rivers, breaking ground for irrigation. The physical labor of making Mesopotamia livable. The tablets describe it clearly. They were digging the watercourses. They were counting the years of toil. 40 years, the text is specific. For 40 years, the Igigi labored, and then they decided they'd had enough. What's preserved on these clay tablets is essentially a strike, a work stoppage, the first labor dispute in literature. The Igigi gather at night. They make a plan, and they march on Enlil's temple at Nippur. They burn their tools, symbolic rejection of their assigned labor. They shout, they refuse, they demand change. The archaeological evidence for the Atrahasis epic comes from several sources. The most complete version is a tablet series from the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BCE, found at Sippar in Iraq. But fragments exist from earlier, and later copies, made by Assyrian scribes 1,000 years afterward, show the story was still being taught, still considered important, still copied and preserved. Touch one of these tablets, if you could, and you'd feel the wedge marks pressed into dried clay. Each tiny impression deliberate, each line part of a larger narrative. The clay is smooth where the scribe's hand didn't press, rough where the stylus cut deeper. Hold it up to light, and the shadows in the wedges make the text easier to read. Ancient scribes knew this, designed the script to work with light and shadow. When Enlil hears the noise outside his temple, the text says he's frightened. That's the word used. Not angry first, frightened. He sends his servant to find out what's happening, and when he learns the Igigi are rebelling, he calls an emergency meeting of the divine assembly and descends from heaven. Enki comes from the Abzu, all the great gods gather. And here's where it gets interesting. Here's where we see the first cracks in divine unity. Some gods want to punish the rebellion, crush it, force the Igigi back to work, maintain order through power. But Enki, clever. Enki suggests something else. He asks why the Igigi are rebelling. What's the actual problem? And when the answer comes, that the work is too hard, too endless, he proposes creating a substitute, a new being designed specifically for labor, humanity. That's Enki's solution. Create humans from clay mixed with divine blood. Make them capable of the work but mortal, limited, controllable. The assembly debates and eventually agrees. The decision is made. Humans will be created. But look what this story reveals. The great gods don't automatically agree. There's debate. There's disagreement about how to respond to challenge. Enlil's instinct is different from Enki's instinct. Power versus wisdom. Force versus cleverness. This divide will run through every subsequent narrative. These two gods, brothers, sons of An, will oppose each other on every major decision. Perhaps the Atrahasis epic is pure mythology. Perhaps it's just how ancient Sumerians explained human origins within their theological framework. That's what most scholars think. But perhaps there's something else preserved here too. Memory of real social tensions, real class struggles, real moments when laborers refused to keep accepting their position in the hierarchy. The Sumerian economy was deeply stratified. Temple complexes owned vast estates, employed thousands. Many of those workers had limited freedom, limited rights, limited say in their conditions. Did they ever rebel? Did they ever refuse to work until conditions improved? We know later periods had labor strikes, workers walking off temple construction projects, demanding better rations, more rest days. Maybe the Atrahasis epic preserves memory of those conflicts, projects them back onto cosmic origins, makes them foundational, says, this tension between those who labor and those who direct labor, it's as old as existence itself. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's how the world works. Or maybe the epic is doing something more subtle. Maybe it's asking a question. If even gods can't maintain a hierarchical system without rebellion, if even divine authority gets challenged, then what does that say about human hierarchies? About kings and priests and merchants and workers? About any system that assigns some to power and others to service? The stars above ancient Mesopotamia offered no answer. They just wheeled through their patterns, patient, unchanging, while below, humans pressed reeds into clay, recording stories of divine workers who refused their assigned roles, who demanded change, who forced the system to adapt. The Igigi rebellion is resolved, at least temporarily. Humans are created. The lesser gods are freed. The hierarchy adjusts, but the precedent is set. Authority can be challenged. The system can be changed. Even cosmic order is negotiable, at least under certain conditions. And that's dangerous knowledge. Because once you know rebellion is possible, once you know the powerful can be frightened, once you know authority depends on consent, then every subsequent conflict carries those implications. Every dispute becomes potentially existential. Every disagreement threatens the whole structure. The tablets don't say what happened to the Igigi after humans were created. Do they just retire? Do they remain resentful? Do they remember that they once refused and won, at least partially? Those questions aren't answered. The story moves on to focus on humanity, on what happens when human population grows, on the next crisis. But the rebellion isn't forgotten. It's foundational. It's the first major conflict the tablets record, the first time divine unity fractured. The first time the assembly had to negotiate with those below them in the hierarchy. The first admission that even gods can't always get their way through force alone. We're moving now from cosmic structure into cosmic friction, from how the system was supposed to work into why it didn't. The Agigi rebellion shows us that divine governance was never smooth, never automatic, never simply accepted by everyone involved. And if lesser gods could rebel against greater gods, then greater gods could certainly conflict with each other, especially when they disagreed about fundamental questions, about how to respond to challenges, about whether power or wisdom should guide decisions, about what to do with humanity once it was created. Those conflicts are coming. They're preserved in detail on tablets we'll explore next. And they'll show us something remarkable, that the Sumerians, 5,000 years ago, understood something we still struggle with today, that creating systems of governance is easier than maintaining them, that authority is always contested, that even the most carefully designed order carries the seeds of its own disruption. Let me tell you about a moment in 1872 that changed how we understand ancient Mesopotamian religion, a moment when a young assistant at the British Museum, a man named George Smith, was translating tablets from Nineveh and realized something shocking. George Smith wasn't a trained academic. He was a banknote engraver who taught himself cuneiform in his spare time. He was brilliant, obsessive. He spent his lunch breaks at the British Museum studying the tablets Austin Henry Layard had shipped back from Iraq decades earlier. And the museum, recognizing his talent, hired him as an assistant, gave him access to the tablets, let him work on translations. On this particular day in November 1872, Smith was working through a series of tablets from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he came across something that made him stand up from his desk, made him, according to witnesses, start pacing the room in excitement. What he'd found was a flood narrative, detailed, specific, with a boat, with animals, with a hero who survives while the rest of humanity drowns. The story predated the Bible by over 1,000 years, and it was clearly the source, or at least a parallel, to the story of Noah. Smith announced his discovery at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology. Victorian England was scandalized, fascinated, confused. If the biblical flood story had Mesopotamian origins, what did that mean about Scripture, about divine revelation, about everything they'd been taught? But here's what's relevant to our story tonight. As Smith and other scholars continued translating, as they worked through more tablets, they started noticing a pattern, a consistent pattern across multiple narratives. Two gods, Enlil and Enki, were always on opposite sides, always disagreeing, always proposing different solutions to the same problems. And this wasn't portrayed as good versus evil. Both were great gods. Both were sons of An. Both held legitimate authority. They just couldn't agree on anything. The flood narrative that shocked Smith, when you read it carefully, isn't about God punishing wickedness. It's about Enlil being annoyed by human noise and deciding to eliminate the problem. The divine assembly votes to send the flood, but Enki, without openly defying the decision, secretly warns a human named Utnapishtim, tells him to build a boat, gives him specifications, saves humanity despite the assembly's vote. When Enlil discovers humans survived, he's furious. But Enki confronts him, argues with him, essentially says Enlil's solution was stupid, too extreme, that eliminating humanity meant eliminating the beings who feed and serve the gods. That wisdom should have tempered power. The assembly, faced with this argument, agrees to a compromise. Humanity continues, but with limits, shorter lifespans, difficult childbirth, high infant mortality. This pattern appears everywhere. In the Atrahasis epic, which predates the flood story, when the Igigi rebel, Enlil wants to crush them. Enki proposes creating humans. When humans multiply too much, Enlil sends plagues and famines. Each time, Enki subverts the plan, teaches humans how to appeal to other gods, how to dig wells, how to survive. The archaeological evidence for this opposition is extensive. It's not just one text. It's dozens, hundreds if you count all the fragments, and they're consistent across centuries. From Old Babylonian texts around 1800 BCE through Assyrian copies 1,000 years later, the characterization remains stable. Enlil is the authoritarian, the enforcer, the one who believes in absolute order maintained through absolute power. Enki is the clever one, the problem solver, the one who believes wisdom and subtlety work better than force. Touch a tablet that contains their disputes, and you're touching something remarkable. These aren't casual mentions. These are extended dialogues, arguments preserved word for word, divine speech recorded as carefully as human speech. The wedge marks pressed into clay with the same care whether recording a god's words or a king's decree. What did Sumerian readers make of this? What did scribes teaching these texts to students say? We don't know exactly, but they kept copying the stories, kept teaching them, generation after generation, which suggests they found value in them, found truth in them somehow. Perhaps they saw their own political struggles reflected. Sumer was never unified under one king for long. Different cities had different rulers with different philosophies. Some kings ruled through military might, others through diplomatic skill. Some believed in centralized authority, others preferred distributed power. Maybe Enlil and Enki represented these competing approaches to governance, made them cosmic, eternal, or perhaps there's something deeper. Perhaps the Sumerians recognized that there are fundamentally different ways of responding to challenges: power or wisdom, force or negotiation, immediate action or patient consideration. And both have merit. Both have costs. Choosing between them is never simple, even for gods. The texts don't portray either god as wrong. That's what's fascinating. Enlil isn't a villain. He genuinely believes in order, in rules, in enforcement. He thinks maintaining cosmic law requires strength, requires being willing to use power decisively. When he sends the flood, from his perspective, he's solving a real problem. Humans have gotten out of control. They're disrupting divine peace. Something must be done. And Enki isn't portrayed as a rebel. He doesn't openly defy authority. He works within the system, mostly. He argues in assembly, makes his case. And when the assembly decides against him, he finds clever workarounds. He respects authority enough not to directly challenge it, but he's willing to bend rules when he thinks the rules are wrong. Two brothers, two approaches, both legitimate, both limited, both necessary somehow, and always in tension with each other. The stars above ancient. Sumer witnessed this theological drama being recorded. Venus, associated with Inanna, rising before dawn. The moon, Nanna, waxing and waning. Jupiter, later called Marduk, moving slowly through the constellations. And scribes sitting in temple libraries, watching those stars, then bending over their clay tablets, carefully preserving stories of divine brothers who couldn't agree. Why did the Sumerians care so much about this relationship? Why preserve these conflicts in such detail? Perhaps because they were trying to work through something fundamental, trying to understand why authority alone isn't enough, why wisdom without power is toothless, why even the best systems require both, and why getting them to work together is almost impossible. Modern scholars debate what Enlil and Enki represent. Some say they're straightforward nature gods, storm and water, power and fertility. Others argue they're more abstract, authority and wisdom, law and craft, order and creativity. Still others suggest they represent different ethnic or cultural traditions within Mesopotamia, northern versus southern, Semitic versus Sumerian, different peoples with different values. All of these interpretations have evidence supporting them. All make sense in different ways. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these divine brothers contain multiple meanings simultaneously. Maybe they're rich enough, complex enough, to sustain multiple readings. What's certain is this: the Sumerian divine world was never unified, never harmonious. From the very beginning, from the oldest texts we have, there's division, disagreement, competing philosophies that can't be reconciled. And those divisions will only deepen as we move forward, as more disputes arise, as the stakes get higher, as the conflicts escalate from arguments to something that starts to look like war. The discovery of these texts in the 1800s gave us back voices that had been silent for millennia. Georgia 2, Smith's excitement that November day was justified. He'd found something extraordinary, not just a flood story, but an entire theology of divine conflict, a sophisticated exploration of power and wisdom and the tensions between them. And those tensions, preserved on clay tablets buried under Iraqi sand for thousands of years, still speak, still ask us to consider the same questions the Sumerians considered. What happens when legitimate authorities disagree? When both sides have good arguments? When compromise seems impossible? The tablets don't provide easy answers. They just show us God struggling with the same problems humans struggle with. And maybe that's answer enough. Once humans were created, once they began to multiply across the land, a new question emerged in the divine assembly. A question that would drive much of the conflict to come. What should be done with humanity now that it exists? The Atrahasis epic continues past creation, past the Igigi rebellion and humanity's making. And what it describes next is fascinating. A series of crises, each one triggered by human success, each one revealing deeper divisions among the gods about what humanity is for. The text says humans multiplied, they spread, they built settlements, they flourished. And this, according to Enlil, was a problem, specifically the noise, human activity, human voices, human life itself was disturbing divine peace. Enlil, trying to sleep in his temple at Nippur, couldn't rest because of the clamor rising from human cities. Modern readers sometimes find this motivation strange. The gods are bothered by noise, that's the crisis. But think about what noise represents. Activity, growth, independence. Humans weren't just quietly serving anymore. They were living their own lives, pursuing their own purposes, making decisions the gods hadn't authorized. The noise wasn't just sound, it was evidence of autonomy. And Enlil, representing order, authority, control, found that threatening. If humans became too independent, too numerous, too powerful, what did that mean for divine authority? For the hierarchy? For the whole system? So Enlil proposed a solution: reduce human population, bring them back under control, make them dependent again. and he had the power to do this. Control the weather, control the water, control the fundamental forces humans needed to survive. The assembly agreed. The decision was made. First, plague. Disease swept through human populations. Numbers dropped. The noise decreased. Problem solved. Except Enki wouldn't accept it. He taught humans how to appeal to Namtar, the plague god, how to make offerings, how to gain relief. The plague ended. Humans recovered. Population rebounded. The noise returned. Enlil tried again. Drought. He withheld rain. Rivers ran low. Crops failed. Famine spread across Mesopotamia. Humans suffered, died. Numbers dropped again. Enlil, presumably, could finally sleep. But again, Enki intervened. He showed humans how to dig wells, how to reach the underground water he controlled, how to irrigate despite the drought. Humans adapted, survived, multiplied again. The tablets describe this pattern repeating. Enlil using his power to reduce humanity, Enki using his wisdom to help them endure. Power versus cleverness, force versus adaptation, and neither winning completely. Each measure Enlil took, Enki countered. Each disaster, humans overcame. Archaeological evidence shows Mesopotamia experienced repeated catastrophes during the period these texts describe. Climate records indicate severe droughts around 2200 BCE, around 2000 BCE. Cities were abandoned, populations crashed. The archaeological record shows clear disruptions. Were these the disasters the texts remember? Real events interpreted as divine conflict? We don't know, can't prove it either way, but it's interesting that the texts in the archaeology align, that stories of divine sent droughts match periods when droughts actually occurred. Maybe the texts preserve memory of real catastrophes. And the theological explanation, Enlil versus Enki, was how people made sense of suffering they couldn't otherwise explain. Finally, according to the epic, Enlil had enough. No more half measures. No more limited disasters that Enki could counter. He proposed total solution. Flood. Drown everything. Wipe the slate clean. Start over, or just leave the world empty and quiet. The divine assembly debated. This was extreme, unprecedented. But Enlil was adamant, and he had authority. He was king of the gods. The assembly, perhaps reluctantly, agreed. The flood would come. All the great gods swore an oath not to reveal the plan to humans. But Enki, bound by his oath not to tell humans directly, found a workaround. He spoke to a reed wall, and Utnapishtim, sleeping behind that wall, overheard. "Build a boat," Enki said to the wall. "Make it watertight. Load it. With seeds and animals. The flood is coming." This is clever writing. The text acknowledges Enki violated the spirit of the oath while technically keeping it. He didn't tell a human. He told a wall. The human just happened to overhear. It's legalistic, sneaky, exactly the kind of solution Enki would devise. The flood came. 7 days and 7 nights of rain. The rivers overflowed. The land disappeared under water. Everything drowned, except Utnapishtim and those on the boat. When the waters receded, when Utnapishtim offered sacrifice, the gods smelled it and realized they were hungry because there were no humans left to feed them, no offerings, no service, no one to maintain the temples. The tablets describe the gods gathering around Utnapishtim's sacrifice like flies, desperate, dependent, realizing too late that they needed humanity, that eliminating humans meant eliminating their own support system. Enlil arrived last, saw survivors, exploded in rage. Someone had violated the oath. Someone had warned humans. But Enki confronted him, argued that sending the flood was foolish, that it solved nothing. that wisdom should have guided the decision, not anger, that there were better ways to manage human population than annihilation. The assembly, faced with the consequences of their decision, agreed to a compromise. Humans would continue, but with limitations. Mortality reinforced, childbirth made difficult, disease made common, enough to keep population manageable without total destruction. Touch the tablets that preserve this story, and you're touching something profound. Not just ancient mythology, but sophisticated exploration of power dynamics, of what happens when authority acts without wisdom, when force is deployed without considering consequences, when those in power forget they depend on those they rule. The dispute over humanity reveals the deepest divide in the Anunnaki assembly. It's not just a disagreement about policy, it's a fundamental difference in philosophy. Enlil sees humans as tools, as means to an end, as problems to be managed or eliminated if management fails. Enki sees them as something else, not equals, certainly, but beings with their own value, their own right to exist, worth protecting even against divine authority. Neither view is purely right or purely wrong. Both contain truth, both have limitations. And the texts don't resolve which is better, they just show the conflict, show how it plays out, show the consequences when neither side will yield. The stars above Mesopotamia witnessed all of this being written down, carefully preserved, copied and recopied across centuries. Students learning these texts in scribal schools, priests citing them in temples. The stories becoming foundational to how Sumerians understood their world. Why did they preserve these conflicts in such detail? Why make divine disagreement so central to their theology? Perhaps because they were realistic. They knew human society was full of conflict, full of competing interests, full of disagreements that couldn't be resolved through debate alone. And they suspected, or believed, or feared that the divine world was the same. Perhaps they found it comforting somehow. If even God struggled to agree, if even cosmic authority is contested, then human conflict isn't failure, it's just reality. It's how existence works. And maybe that takes some pressure off. Maybe it makes human struggles feel less shameful, less evidence of our inadequacy. Or maybe they were trying to warn themselves, trying to preserve the memory of what happens when authority acts rashly, when power is deployed without wisdom, when those who rule forget they need those they govern. The flood as cautionary tale, divine regret as lesson. We're moving deeper now into the conflicts. We've seen the Igigi rebellion, the Enlil-Enki divide, the dispute over humanity, and we're building towards something, toward the territorial competitions, toward the challenges to hierarchy, toward the texts that describe what sounds like divine civil war. But first we need to understand the world these conflicts created, the cities that rose under competing gods, the culture that flourished despite divine discord, the Golden Age, if you can call it that, when Sumerian civilization reached its peak, even as the divine assembly fractured. That's where we're going next. To see what humanity built while the gods argued above them, and to wonder about what that tells us about the resilience of civilization, the persistence of culture, the human capacity to create meaning even in the shadow of cosmic dysfunction. Some gods played by the rules, respected the hierarchy, worked within the system. And then there was Inanna. She's perhaps the most complex deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Goddess of love, goddess of war. Two things that seem completely opposite, but maybe aren't when you think about them. Both involve passion, Both involve conquest. Both involve claiming what you desire, regardless of consequences. And Inanna, more than any other god, seemed comfortable with contradiction, with chaos, with disruption. The evening star, that's what she was in the sky. Venus, the brightest object besides the sun and moon, rising in the west just after sunset, brilliant against the darkening blue, or appearing in the east before dawn, heralding sunrise. The same planet, but in different positions. Morning star and evening star. Two roles, two aspects, one goddess. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomers tracked her carefully, recorded her movements with precision that still impresses modern scholars. They knew her cycle, knew when she'd appear as evening star, when she'd disappear, when she'd reappear as morning star, knew the rhythm took 584 days to complete, and they associated each phase with different aspects of her personality, her moods, her intentions. When Venus appeared as evening star, Inanna was the goddess of love, of beauty, of desire, of everything soft and alluring. But when she appeared as morning star, she was the warrior, the conqueror, the one who led armies and destroyed cities. Same goddess, completely different energy. The tablets describe both. Hymns to her beauty alongside hymns to her terror. Poetry about her sexual power alongside descriptions of her violence. This duality made her dangerous, unpredictable. You couldn't count on Inanna to stay in her lane, to respect boundaries, to follow the rules everyone else followed. There's a famous story preserved on tablets from around 2000 BCE. Inanna decides she wants the Me, those cosmic principles we talked about earlier, those fundamental powers that govern reality, and she knows Enki has them, keeps them in his temple in Eridu, the Abzu. So she goes to visit him. Imagine the scene. Inanna, beautiful, charming, arriving at Eridu. Enki, god of wisdom, welcoming her. They sit down, together, drink beer. In the tablets, it's very clear, they drink a lot of beer. And as Enki gets drunk, as his judgment becomes impaired, Inanna asks for the Me, one by one. Give me kingship, she says, and Enki, drunk and generous, agrees. Give me priesthood, and he agrees again. On and on through the list, over 100 Me, all the fundamental powers, and Enki, too drunk to think clearly, gives them all to her. Then Inanna leaves, quickly, loads the Me into her boat, heads back to Uruk, her city, and when Enki sobers up the next morning, realizes what he's done, he's horrified. He sends his servant to chase after her, to get the Me back. But Inanna is too fast, too clever. She reaches Uruk before he can catch her, claims the Me as her own, and Enki, despite being god of wisdom, can't do anything about it. This story is remarkable for several reasons. First, it shows a goddess stealing from a great god and getting away with it, challenging male authority successfully. Second, it shows even the god of wisdom can be tricked, can make mistakes, can be manipulated. Third, it establishes Inanna as someone willing to break rules, to take what she wants, to operate outside the system when the system doesn't serve her. The archaeological evidence for Inanna's importance is everywhere. Her temples in Uruk were massive, the largest religious structures in early Sumer. Thousands of people worked there, enormous resources devoted to her worship. And Uruk itself, her city, was the biggest city in the world for centuries. By 3000 BCE, maybe 50,000 people lived there, an unprecedented concentration of humanity, all under the patronage of this contradictory, dangerous, fascinating goddess. But Inanna didn't just rule Uruk. She involved herself in other cities' affairs. The tablets describe her abandoning cities when she got bored with them, switching allegiances, supporting one king, then turning against him, starting wars. She's associated with the fall of Akkad, the destruction of Ur, the rise and fall of multiple dynasties. When Inanna withdrew her favor, cities collapsed. When she granted it, cities flourished. Some scholars suggest Inanna represents the political reality of Mesopotamia. Cities constantly shifting alliances. No permanent friends or enemies. Just interests. Just power. Just the endless competition for resources and prestige. If Enlil represents stable authority and Enki represents patient wisdom, maybe Inanna represents chaos, change, the unpredictable forces that destabilize even the best-laid plans. Others see her as representing female power in a male-dominated pantheon. She's not subordinate to any male god, not anyone's wife or daughter, primarily. She has her own authority, her own domain, her own cult, and she doesn't ask permission, doesn't wait for male gods to grant her power. She takes it, steals it if necessary, and no one, not even Enki, can stop her. There's another famous story about Inanna, her descent to the underworld. She decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, goddess of the dead. No one goes to the underworld and returns. That's not how death works, but Inanna goes anyway, demands entrance, and at each of 7 gates, she's required to remove something, a piece of clothing, jewelry, symbols of her power. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal, she's naked, powerless, and Ereshkigal kills her, hangs her corpse on a hook. Above, in the world of the living, everything stops. Without Inanna, there's no reproduction, no desire, no life force. The world starts dying. The gods panic. And eventually, through trickery and negotiation, Inanna is revived, returns. But someone has to take her place in the underworld. That's the rule. She chooses her lover, Dumuzi, sends him to die in her place. What does this story mean? Scholars have debated for over a century. Some say it's about the seasons. Inanna descending into death, representing winter. Her return, representing spring. Others suggest it's about initiation, about spiritual death and rebirth. Still others read it as political allegory, a goddess losing and regaining power, sacrificing her lover to maintain her position. Maybe it's all of these, maybe it's none. What's clear is that Inanna, more than any other deity, was associated with transformation, with crossing boundaries, with challenging the order everyone else maintained, and in a divine assembly trying to govern through consensus and hierarchy. A goddess who refused to respect either was a constant source of disruption. The stars above ancient Mesopotamia showed no such chaos. Venus moved in regular patterns, predictable, mathematical. You could calculate exactly when she'd appear as evening star, when she'd disappear, when she'd reappear as morning star. The ancient astronomers did this, wrote it all down. The sky was orderly, reliable. But the goddess associated with that planet, anything but orderly, anything but reliable. And maybe that contradiction tells us something. Maybe it says that even within cosmic order, even within predictable patterns, there's room for chaos, for unpredictability, for forces that destabilize and disrupt and refuse to be contained. Inanna didn't cause the conflicts between the Anunnaki, but she didn't help resolve them either. She played sides against each other, took advantage of divine discord for her own benefit, made the whole situation more complicated, more unstable, more prone to escalation. In a system already strained by the Enlil-Enki divide, by the resentments of the lesser gods, by the disputes over humanity. Inanna's presence added another variable, another source of unpredictability, another reason why consensus became harder and harder to achieve. We're building toward something, toward the texts that describe open conflict, toward the wars between cities that become wars between gods, toward the breakdown of divine assembly into competing factions. And Inanna, goddess of love and war, will be right in the middle of it, sometimes causing it, sometimes benefiting from it, always comfortable with the chaos. But first we need to see what happened when divine conflicts became earthly conflicts, when the competition between gods manifested as war between cities, when humans became soldiers in divine disputes they barely understood. Let me tell you about a specific war, a real war, not mythology, not legend, a documented historical conflict between two Sumerian city-states in the 25th century BCE, a war that lasted for generations, a war over water, a war that both sides claimed their gods not only authorized, but fought in. The year is approximately 2450 BCE. The place is southern Mesopotamia, and two cities, Lagash and Umma, have been disputing a border for as long as anyone can remember. The disputed territory is called Gu Edin, a strip of fertile land between the cities, good agricultural land, but more importantly, land that controls water flow. Canals run through it. Water that Lagash needs passes through territory Umma can block. It's not just about the land, it's about survival. The conflict has gone through cycles, periods of peace, periods of fighting, treaties made and broken. But around 2450 BCE, it escalates. The ruler of Lagash is a man named Eannatum, young, ambitious, determined to settle the Guadine question permanently. He raises an army, trains them, equips them with bronze weapons, still rare, still expensive, and he marches toward Umma. Imagine being a soldier in that army. You're a farmer most of the year, working fields, managing irrigation. But now you're carrying a spear, wearing a helmet, marching in formation. You've trained for this, practiced, but this is your first real battle, your first time facing other men who want to kill you. You're terrified, excited, convinced that your cause is just. Because the priests have told you, your god Ningirsu, the patron of Lagash, demands this. Umma has violated sacred boundaries, stolen what belongs to Lagash, to Ningirsu, and you're fighting not just for your city, but for your god. The battle happens near the disputed border. The exact location is debated by modern archaeologists, but what happened isn't debated, because Eannatum commissioned a monument afterward, a massive stone stele carved with text and images describing his victory. We call it the Stele of the Vultures, and it's one of the most important historical documents from early Mesopotamia. The stele is broken now, fragments, but enough survives to read the story. The front shows Eannatum leading his troops. They're in formation, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward, the phalanx, one of the earliest depictions of organized military tactics, and they're marching over dead bodies, enemies fallen, defeated. Above them, vultures circle, picking at corpses. That's where the modern name comes from. But the back of the stele is even more interesting, because it doesn't show human soldiers. It shows Ningirsu, the god himself, giant, towering, holding a net, and caught in that net, writhing, trying to escape, are the soldiers of Umma, the enemy army trapped by divine intervention. The god, not just blessing the battle, but fighting in it, directly participating. The inscription is clear. Eannatum fought, but so did Ningirsu. The victory belongs to both, and the defeated, they're not just losing to Lagash, they're losing to a god. The text describes the casualties. 3,600 men of Umma killed, a staggering number for ancient warfare, a devastating defeat. But here's what's fascinating. Umma has its own version, its own inscriptions, its own god, Shara, and in Umma's texts, Shara supported them, blessed their cause, fought for them, both cities, both armies, both believing their god authorized the war, both believing divine power backed them, both convinced they were fighting a holy war. So what happened? How do you reconcile two gods both claiming to support opposite sides? The Sumerian answer was simple. The gods themselves were in conflict. Ningirsu and Shara, like their cities, were at war. The human conflict reflected, or caused, or was caused by, divine conflict. The earthly and cosmic levels weren't separate. They were the same war happening on different planes. After the battle, Eannatum negotiated terms. Umma agreed to pay tribute, to respect the boundaries Lagash established, to acknowledge defeat. The Stele of the Vultures was erected to commemorate the victory, to warn Umma never to challenge Lagash again, to show future generations what happens when you oppose Ningirsu. But it didn't end there. It never does. 20 years later, a new ruler in Umma renounced the treaty, stopped paying tribute, claimed the boundaries were unjust, and the war started again, and again, and again. For over a century, Lagash and Umma fought. Truces would hold for a generation, then collapse. New rulers, new grievances, new battles, and each time, both sides claimed divine authorization. Both performed rituals before battle. Both believed their god was with them. Both interpreted victory as proof of divine favor and defeat as temporary divine punishment, requiring more devotion, more offerings, more fervent prayer. The archaeological evidence for these wars is extensive. Weapons, fortifications, destruction layers at both cities, administrative texts recording military expenditures. The Stele of the Vultures is the most famous artifact, but there are dozens of others. Royal inscriptions, temple dedications, treaties, all describing conflicts between cities framed as conflicts between gods. Touch one of these inscriptions. If you could visit a museum, and you'd feel the stone cold and smooth where it's been polished, rough where the carving is deep. The cuneiform wedges cut with precision, each character clear. This wasn't casual graffiti. This was official history, commissioned by kings, approved by priests, meant to last forever. What does this tell us about divine conflict? About how the Sumerians understood the relationship between earthly and heavenly authority? It suggests they saw no separation. When cities fought, gods fought. When gods fought, cities fought. The two were inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other. Perhaps this was how they made sense of war, how they justified the violence, the suffering, the death. It's not just human ambition or greed, it's cosmic necessity. The gods themselves are in conflict. We're just fulfilling their will, fighting their battles, serving their purposes. There's meaning in the violence, divine meaning, sacred purpose. Or perhaps it's more cynical. Perhaps rulers used divine authorization to motivate troops, to justify conquest, to claim legitimacy. Fight for your god, not for your king. Die for cosmic order, not for territorial gain. It's effective propaganda, hard to argue against. If the god demands it, who are you to refuse? The stars above these battlefields offered no judgment. They wheeled through their patterns as they always had, indifferent to the violence below. The same stars that had watched the first humans emerge, the first cities rise, the first temples built, now watching armies clash, watching soldiers die, watching cities burn and rebuild and burn again. And in temples in both Lagash and Umma, priests watched those same stars, tracked Venus and Jupiter and Mars, looked for omens, for divine signs, for indication of which god was winning, which god would prevail. The sky, constant and predictable in its motions, was read as communication from gods who were anything but constant, anything but predictable. The territorial wars weren't unique to Lagash and Umma. This pattern repeated across Mesopotamia. Ur fighting Uruk, Kish claiming supremacy over the south, Eridu resisting northern expansion, every border disputed, every water right contested, every city believing its god was supreme, its claim legitimate, its cause just, and the divine assembly, supposedly governing, supposedly mediating, supposedly maintaining order, unable to resolve these disputes, unable to force consensus, unable to prevent gods and their cities from fighting each other. The system was breaking down, or perhaps revealing that it had never really worked. That divine governance through assembly and vote, like human governance, was more aspiration than reality. That when interests conflicted fundamentally, when resources were finite, when prestige mattered as much as survival, then consensus became impossible and conflict became inevitable. We're seeing now how divine philosophy, Enlil versus Enki, translated into divine politics. How the hierarchy bred resentments that couldn't be resolved. How geography created competitions that couldn't be avoided. And how all of this manifested in human warfare that the gods themselves, according to the texts, participated in. But there's more, because territorial wars weren't the only kind of conflict. There was another kind, more subtle, more dangerous, the kind that happened within the assembly itself, when democratic process failed, when votes deadlocked, when compromise became impossible. That's where we're going next, to the heart of divine governance, and to see why it couldn't hold. The divine assembly at Nippur was supposed to prevent chaos. That was its whole purpose. Provide a forum where disputes could be resolved through debate, through vote, through collective wisdom. Even gods, powerful as they were, would submit their grievances to the assembly, accept its authority, abide by its decisions. That was the theory, and for a time, maybe it worked. Maybe the structure held. Maybe consensus was possible when the stakes were lower, when the conflicts were simpler, when the gods still believed in the system. But systems strain, systems break, and the texts preserve evidence of assembly failure, of deadlock, of democratic process collapsing under the weight of irreconcilable differences. The clearest example comes from the flood narrative, but not the version most people know, not the simplified biblical version, the original Mesopotamian account in the Atrahasis epic. Because that text describes in detail what happened in the divine assembly when the question of humanity's fate was debated. Enlil brought the proposal. Humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too independent. Something had to be done. He'd tried disease, he'd tried famine, he'd tried drought. Each time, humans survived. Each time, they adapted. Each time, Enki had helped them. So now Enlil proposed a final solution: flood, Total destruction. Start over. The assembly had to vote. And here's what's remarkable. The text describes debate, real debate, gods arguing, some supporting Enlil, some opposing, Enki making his case, others making theirs. This isn't divine autocracy. It's divine democracy. Messy, contentious, uncertain. But eventually, the assembly voted. The decision was made. The flood would come. All gods swore an oath not to warn humanity. It was cosmic law now, binding, final, except it wasn't. Because Enki, while bound by the letter of the oath, found a way around its spirit, spoke to a wall, let Utnapishtim overhear, saved humanity despite the assembly's decision. And when Enlil discovered this, when he realized the vote had been subverted, he was furious. Not just at the outcome, at the process, at the idea that assembly decisions could be circumvented through cleverness. This moment, preserved on clay tablets 4,000 years old, captures something profound. It shows democratic process failing, not because the vote wasn't held, not because the debate wasn't genuine, but because the losing side, Enki, refused to accept the outcome, found a workaround, acted against the collective decision. And what could the assembly do? Punish Enki? He was one of the great three, son of An, brother to Enlil, fundamental to cosmic order. You can't just remove him, can't strip his authority, can't enforce consequences without destabilizing everything. So, the assembly, faced with this defiance, compromised, allowed humanity to continue, adjusted the decision, weakened it, which established a precedent. That assembly votes weren't truly binding, that the powerful could subvert them, that clever gods could find workarounds, that collective decisions were only as strong as the most powerful god's willingness to accept them. Imagine being a lesser god watching this, watching Enki defy the assembly and face no real consequences, watching the system bend to accommodate him because he was too powerful to punish. What does that teach you? That the assembly is a fiction, that real power trumps democratic process, that hierarchy, no matter what the official structure says, determines outcomes. The tablets don't spell this out explicitly, but the implication is clear. The flood narrative, rather than demonstrating assembly strength, demonstrates its weakness, shows that when high-stakes decisions go against powerful members, those members simply don't comply, and the system can't enforce compliance. This pattern appears in other texts too. Inanna stealing the ME from Enki. The assembly can't make her return them. She's too powerful. Her city too important. So the theft stands, becomes accepted, becomes fact. Ningirsu and Shara fighting over Lagish and Umma. The assembly can't resolve it, can't force peace. Both gods claim legitimacy. Both have followers, so the war continues. The assembly at Nippur, in theory neutral ground, in practice became a venue for deadlock. Gods arrived representing their city's interests, not the cosmic good, not collective welfare, their own advantage, their own prestige, their own concerns. And when interests conflicted, when votes split, when compromise was unacceptable to one side, then the assembly simply failed to function. Some texts describe votes splitting evenly. 25 gods on one side, 25 on the other. Stalemate. No decision possible. And unlike human assemblies, which might have tiebreaker mechanisms, the divine assembly had none. Or if it did, the texts don't preserve them. So deadlock meant paralysis, meant the issue remained unresolved, meant gods acted unilaterally despite assembly authority. Perhaps this mirrors something the Sumerians saw in their own governance. City assemblies of elders that couldn't agree, councils that deadlocked, democratic processes that failed when stakes were too high. And rather than seeing this as unique to human fallibility, they imagined it happening among gods too, made it cosmic, universal, the inevitable consequence of collective governance without ultimate authority. Or perhaps the tablets preserve criticism of the assembly system, a suggestion that democracy, at cosmic or human scale, doesn't work when interests diverge too much, when philosophical differences run too deep, when powerful members refuse to accept collective decisions, that maybe hierarchy, maybe central authority, maybe even autocracy works better than endless debate and subverted votes. The stars above Nippur offered no such doubts. They moved in their patterns, regular, predictable. No assembly voted on when Venus would appear. No debate determined Jupiter's path. Cosmic order in the sky functioned smoothly, automatically, without democratic process. Perhaps some scribes, watching those stars from the ziggurat, wondered if cosmic order on Earth should work the same way. But it didn't, couldn't, because gods, unlike stars, had wills, had interests, had pride, had the ability to resist, to defy, to subvert, and a system requiring their consent, requiring their cooperation, was only as strong as their willingness to cooperate, which, increasingly, they weren't. The assembly deadlocked on smaller issues too, not just flood or humanity's fate. Water rights disputes between cities, territory boundaries, allocation of offerings, distribution of prestige. Every issue became contested, every vote split, every decision challenged by those who disagreed. And lesser gods, watching the great gods fight, learned that authority was negotiable, that cosmic law was flexible, that power mattered more than process. The Igigi had rebelled and won concessions. Enki had defied the assembly and faced no real punishment. Inanna had stolen and kept what she stole. Why respect the system when the system didn't work? Why abide by decisions when decisions weren't enforced? The cracks were widening, the fractures deepening, and we're approaching the texts that describe not just dysfunction, not just disagreement, but something more, something that starts to look like war, divine factions forming, choosing sides, taking up cosmic weapons, fighting not through proxies, not through earthly cities, but directly, God against God, power against power. The assembly completely abandoned in favor of force. But before we get there, we need to look at one more kind of divine conflict. Not philosophical like Enlil versus Enki, not territorial like Ningirsu versus Shara, but professional, competitive. The kind that happens when multiple gods claim the same domain, when warrior gods compete for supremacy, when even functional roles become sources of conflict. That's where we're going next, to see how deep the divisions ran, how thoroughly the system had fractured. There's something almost tragic about what happened with the warrior gods, because they should have been natural allies, should have worked together, should have shared the domain of warfare rather than competing over it. But that's not how it worked out. Ningirsu, he was Lagash's champion, the city's patron deity, god of war and agriculture. An interesting combination when you think about it. Both involve conquest. Both involve claiming territory and making it productive. He appears in texts from the earliest periods of Sumerian history. By 2500 BCE, when the Lagash-Umma wars escalate, he's fully established, powerful, widely worshipped. The stele of the vultures shows him, giant, fierce, holding his net, capturing enemies like fish. The image was meant to inspire, to terrify, to show that Lagash had divine power on their side. And for generations, it worked. Lagash dominated its region, conquered neighbors, expanded territory, all under Ningirsu's patronage. But Ningirsu wasn't the only war god, and that was a problem, because Ninurta, associated with Nippur initially, later with other cities, claimed the same domain. God of war, god of hunting, god of storms and power. His arsenal was legendary. The texts describe his weapons in detail. Sharur, his talking mace, a weapon with its own intelligence, its own will. Other weapons with names, with personalities, with specific functions. The Lugali epic, one of the longer Sumerian narratives, is essentially a catalog of Ninurta's victories. It describes him fighting a Zag, a demon of the mountains, defeating enemies, conquering territories, establishing cosmic order through military power. It's heroic epic in the classic sense. The warrior god proving his worth through battle after battle after battle. And here's where it gets interesting, because Ningirsu and Ninurta have overlapping roles, overlapping attributes, even overlapping myths. Some scholars suggest they might have been the same god originally, different regional names for the same deity. But by the historical period we're examining, by 2500 to 2000 BCE, they're clearly distinct, separate gods, with separate cults, separate cities, separate followers, and competing claims to supremacy in warfare. Imagine being a Sumerian trying to decide which god to pray to before battle, Ningirsu or Ninurta. Both claim to be the best warrior. Both have impressive victory records. Both promise divine support to those who worship them properly. How do you choose? And what does your choice mean about divine politics? About which faction you're aligning with? This kind of competition appears throughout the Mesopotamian pantheon. Multiple sun gods, multiple wisdom gods, multiple gods of every major function. Why? Why not one god per domain? Wouldn't that be simpler, more efficient? Perhaps because different cities needed their own patrons, needed to claim divine power for themselves. If Lagash worshipped Ningirsu, and Ningirsu was the supreme war god, then Lagash had advantage over other cities. But Nippur couldn't accept that, couldn't let Lagash claim military supremacy. So Nippur promoted Ninurta, made him the real champion, the true war god. And suddenly you have competition, divine one-upmanship, gods trying to outdo each other in demonstrations of power. The texts preserve some of this competition. Not directly, they're not explicit about divine rivalry, but indirectly, in the way each city's myths amplify their patrons' achievements. Ningirsu didn't just win battles, he won the greatest battles. Ninurta didn't just have weapons, he had the most powerful weapons, each trying to claim superiority, each trying to attract worshippers, each trying to prove they deserved first place in the divine hierarchy. Because reputation mattered. In the divine world, just like the human world, if you're known as a great warrior, other gods respect you, fear you, listen when you speak in assembly. Your city benefits, gets better treatment, more favorable terms in negotiations. Prestige has practical value, and the way you built reputation, through your worshippers, through their victories. When Lagash defeated that was Ningirsu's victory. When armies won, their patron gods won. When cities prospered, their gods prospered. The earthly and divine were linked. Success on one level translated to success on the other. So warrior gods needed wars, needed victories, needed their cities to fight and win, because every victory enhanced their standing. Every defeat diminished it. This created perverse incentives. Did Ningirsu want peace between Lagash and Did Did Ninurta benefit from cities resolving disputes through negotiation? Not really. Their power, their prestige, their position in the divine hierarchy depended on conflict, on having opportunities to demonstrate martial prowess. The stars above saw all of this. Mars, the Red Wanderer, was associated with Nergal, another war god we haven't even discussed yet. The violent planet, the bloody planet, moving through the sky in patterns that ancient astronomers tracked with precision, calculating when Mars would appear, when it would disappear, when it would be bright or dim, looking for omens, for signs of divine favor, for indication of which god was ascendant. But planets don't compete. Mars doesn't fight Jupiter for dominance. They just move through their orbits, following physical laws, indifferent to human interpretation. The competition, the rivalry, the need to prove supremacy, that's all human projection. All our anxieties about status and power and reputation mapped onto the cosmos. Or maybe not. Maybe the Sumerians were onto something. Maybe they recognized that any system with multiple centers of power, multiple authorities claiming the same domain, will inevitably breed competition. Will create situations where proving you're better than your peer becomes more important than serving the collective good, where individual prestige trumps systemic harmony. This pattern appears in human organizations constantly. Multiple generals competing for glory, multiple executives competing for promotion, multiple departments competing for resources. It's not unique to divine assemblies. It's universal. And maybe that's what the Sumerians were recording, not unique divine dysfunction, but universal patterns of competition and conflict that appear wherever there's hierarchy and status and limited resources. The competition between Ningirsu and Ninurta never resolved. There's no text saying one defeated the other, no clear winner. They just continued parallel, each claiming supremacy, each attracting followers, each accumulating myths of victory, and their cities, their human worshippers, continued fighting, continued trying to prove their god was strongest, continued feeding the divine competition with earthly blood. By 2000 BCE, when Sumerian civilization was entering its final phase, when new powers were rising, when Babylon would soon dominate, the old divine order was clearly breaking down. The assembly couldn't function. The great gods were divided. Lesser gods were resentful. The territorial gods were fighting. The functional gods were competing. Every level of the system showed strain. And still, somehow, civilization continued. Cities functioned. Crops grew. Trade flourished. Humans lived their lives, built their temples, performed their rituals, raised their children. The divine dysfunction didn't prevent human achievement, didn't stop culture from developing, didn't halt progress. Which makes you wonder, how much did divine order actually matter? If gods could fight and cities could still thrive, if assembly could deadlock and society could still function, then maybe cosmic governance was less important than the Sumerians thought. Maybe human systems worked despite divine chaos rather than because of divine order. Or maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe divine conflict was the mechanism, the driver, the creative chaos that prevented stagnation, that forced adaptation, that made humans self-reliant. Maybe a perfectly harmonious divine assembly would have produced a static society. And the conflicts, the competition, the divine dysfunction, that's what created dynamism, change, progress. We're approaching the texts that describe open warfare, divine weapons deployed, catastrophic consequences, the final breakdown of whatever order remained. But hidden beneath those dramatic narratives, beneath the descriptions of cosmic battle, there might be something else, a sophisticated understanding of how systems work, how authority functions, how competition and cooperation coexist, how conflict drives change. That's what we're going to explore next. The hidden dimensions, the symbolic meanings, the deeper implications of divine warfare. What these ancient texts might be preserving beyond their surface narratives. What wisdom might be encoded in stories of gods who couldn't get along. Beneath the stories of territorial disputes and philosophical disagreements, beneath the accounts of rebellions and assembly deadlocks, there's another layer, another kind of conflict the tablets preserve, one that's more abstract, more mysterious, one that involves the ME. We've mentioned the ME before, those cosmic principles that govern reality. Kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, warfare, agriculture, sexuality, music, hundreds of them. Every fundamental aspect of existence, every social role, every skill, every institution, all governed by me. Divine powers, transferable, stealable, hoardable. But what were they really? The tablets never explain. They assume the reader knows, assumes it's obvious, which suggests the ME weren't abstract concepts to the Sumerians. They were something concrete, something you could possess, something worth fighting over. Some scholars interpret the ME as purely symbolic, metaphors for authority, for legitimacy. When a city claims to possess certain me, it's claiming the right to practice those activities, the right to have kings, to conduct rituals, to make war. It's political language, cultural competition expressed through theological vocabulary. And there's evidence for this. Cities absolutely competed over which could claim which ME, which had divine authorization for which functions. But other scholars wonder if there's something more hidden here, something we're missing. The specificity troubles easy dismissal. The way the texts describe ME as transferable objects. The way they can be stolen, as Inanna stole them from Enki. The way they can be lost, as cities that are conquered lose their ME to the victors. It sounds almost technological, like data, like code, like information that can be copied, transmitted, possessed. What if the ME were actual knowledge, actual techniques, actual technologies that the gods possessed and granted selectively to humanity? What if stealing the ME meant stealing knowledge, learning secrets you weren't supposed to know? This interpretation is more controversial. Mainstream archaeology rejects it, but it persists because the language is so concrete, so physical, so specific about possession and transfer. The story of Inanna stealing the ME from Enki is worth looking at more carefully because it's not just about theft. It's about intoxication, about lowered defenses, about wisdom personified by Enki being compromised, and about beauty and cunning personified by Inanna exploiting that vulnerability. Imagine what's really happening beneath the surface narrative. Enki has knowledge, fundamental knowledge about how reality works, how to organize society, how to conduct rituals, how to practice crafts, and he keeps this knowledge in the Abzu, the underground waters, the hidden depths. It's secret knowledge, esoteric knowledge, not meant for everyone. Inanna wants it, wants access to what Enki knows, but she can't just take it by force. Enki is one of the great three, too powerful to rob directly, so she uses a different approach: charm, seduction, social manipulation, gets him to lower his guard, gets him drunk, and in that compromised state, gets him to give her what she wants. And once she has it, once the ME are transferred, they can't be taken back. The knowledge is out. The secret is revealed. You can chase after her, which Enki does. But you can't unlearn what's been learned. Can't unsteal what's been stolen. The ME, whatever they actually were, had this property. Once transferred, the transfer was permanent. This creates a hidden dimension of divine conflict. Not just territorial, not just philosophical, but informational, about who knows what, who controls which knowledge, who has access to which techniques, and about the fear that comes with losing monopoly on knowledge. If everyone has the ME, if every city possesses the same divine powers, then what makes you special? What gives you advantage? What justifies your claim to supremacy? Perhaps this is why the gods fought, not just over land or resources, but over knowledge, over techniques, over the secrets that separated those who knew from those who didn't. Every time a city conquered another, every time a god's ME were transferred, that was knowledge spreading, secrets becoming less secret, power becoming less concentrated. The astronomical dimension is interesting too, because some of the ME are specifically related to understanding the sky, to tracking celestial movements, to predicting astronomical events. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers. By 2000 BCE, they could predict lunar eclipses, could calculate planetary positions years in advance, could track Venus through her complete cycle. This knowledge was sacred, temple knowledge, priestly knowledge. You couldn't just look up at the sky and understand what you were seeing. You needed to be taught, needed to learn the mathematics, the patterns, the methods, needed access to generations of recorded observations, needed, in other words, the ME of astronomy. And what if that knowledge was initially monopolized, held by one temple, one god's priesthood? What if other cities, other gods, had to steal it, had to send their priests to learn secretly, had to acquire the astronomical ME through cleverness rather than being granted them officially? The tablets hint at this. Describe conflicts over temple libraries, over who controls which texts, over access to recorded knowledge. It's not just about political authority, it's about informational authority, about who gets to know, who gets to teach, who controls the transmission of understanding from generation to generation. The silence around what the ME actually were is perhaps deliberate. Perhaps the scribes who wrote these texts knew, assumed their contemporary readers knew, but didn't write it down explicitly because making secret knowledge public defeats the purpose of keeping it secret. So they wrote around it, alluded to it, described its effects without describing its nature. And now, 4,000 years later, we're left trying to interpret, trying to understand what they meant, trying to decode what was hidden in plain sight for their original audience, but obscure to us. Perhaps the ME were nothing more than social consensus, the collective agreement that certain people had authority to do certain things, that kings could rule because they possessed the ME of kingship, that priests could perform rituals because they possessed the ME of priesthood, and theft, in this interpretation, means claiming authority you weren't granted, legitimacy you didn't earn, position you took rather than received. This would make the conflicts over me essentially about legitimacy, about who has the right to do what, and in societies where divine authorization determined everything, where you couldn't just declare yourself king without claiming the god gave you that right. Controlling the narrative of ME, possession mattered intensely. Or perhaps, and this is pure speculation, perhaps the ME were older than the Sumerians. Perhaps they were inherited, received from whoever built the first temples, whoever established the first cities, whoever started the first civilizations. And the gods, in Sumerian theology, were the custodians of this ancient knowledge, the preservers of techniques and understanding that predated even the earliest Sumerian settlements. If that's true, if the ME represent knowledge from before, then conflicts over them aren't just about contemporary competition. They're about access to the deep past, to the origins of civilization, to the secrets of whoever came before. And fighting over that, hoarding it, stealing it, that's fighting over humanity's entire inheritance. The stars above offer no clarity. They shine as they always have, patient, silent, keeping their own secrets. The Sumerians watched those stars and learned to predict their movements, gained the astronomical ME. But what did the stars know that the Sumerians didn't? What patterns exist beyond what ancient astronomers could detect? What deeper understanding remains hidden even now? The tablets preserve conflicts over ME without fully explaining what was being fought over. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some things are meant to remain partly obscured, partly mysterious, known to those who need to know, unknown to those who don't, the hidden dimension staying hidden. We're seeing now that divine conflict operated on multiple levels: territory, philosophy, hierarchy, knowledge, each layer adding complexity, each dimension revealing new reasons for discord. And we're approaching the texts that describe the culmination, the moment when conflicts that had been building for centuries finally exploded, when a new god challenged the entire ancient order, when the old gods discovered they could be displaced. That's where we're going next. To Babylon, to Marduk, to the text that describes cosmic revolution. There's a moment in Mesopotamian history when everything shifts, when the entire divine hierarchy, established for thousands of years, gets challenged, when a relatively minor god, patron of a relatively minor city, suddenly claims supremacy over all the ancient Anunnaki, and the old gods, Enlil and Enki and An and all the rest, have to decide whether to accept this, whether to resist, whether to fight. The god is Marduk. The city is Babylon. And the text that describes his rise is called the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, written down around 1100 BCE, though possibly composed earlier. And what it describes is nothing less than cosmic revolution. Beneath the surface narrative, beneath the story of Marduk defeating Tiamat, the chaos monster, and creating the world from her corpse, there's something else, a political document, a theological argument, a justification for Babylon's dominance and Marduk's supremacy, but also, perhaps, memory of real conflict, real resistance, real old gods who didn't accept the new order without protest. The Enuma Elish begins with the old gods, Apsu, the fresh water, Tiamat, the salt water, An, Enlil, Enki, the familiar names, the established order. But then younger gods appear, louder gods, more energetic, and the old gods, particularly Apsu, find them disturbing, too noisy, too active, too disruptive. Does this sound familiar? It should. It's the same complaint Enlil made about humans. Too noisy, too disturbing, too threatening to established order. But now, in the Enuma Elish, it's not humans disturbing the gods. It's younger gods disturbing older gods. The hierarchy itself being challenged from within. Apsu decides to destroy the younger gods, restore quiet, restore the way things were. But Enki, always clever, Enki, discovers the plot, puts Apsu to sleep with magic, kills him, and from Apsu's body, from the corpse of the old order, establishes his own temple, his own dominion, the passing of power from one generation to the next. But Tiamat, Apsu's consort, isn't ready to accept this. She raises an army of monsters, of ancient creatures, of forces loyal to the old ways, and the younger gods, faced with this threat, panic. They need a champion, someone powerful enough to face Tiamat. And that's when Marduk steps forward. He offers to fight, to save the younger gods. But he has a condition. If he defeats Tiamat, if he saves everyone, then he gets to be king, supreme king, above even An, above even Enlil. The younger gods agree. They're desperate. They need him, so they grant him supreme authority. Marduk fights Tiamat, defeats her, kills her, cuts her body in half, makes the sky from one half and the earth from the other, creates the world as we know it, and then, having saved everyone, claims his reward, the supreme kingship, the position above all other gods. The Enuma Elish describes a ceremony, the gods gathering, proclaiming Marduk's 50 names, each name a title, each title an aspect of power. They're not just acknowledging his victory, they're transferring authority, giving him the ME, making him supreme. And the text says they did this willingly, gratefully, because he saved them. But did they? Beneath the official narrative, beneath the Babylonian propaganda, is there evidence of resistance, of old gods who didn't want to accept this upstart, who resented having their ancient authority superseded by a relative newcomer? Some scholars think yes. They point to other texts, texts that aren't from Babylon, texts that preserve the old theology, where An is still supreme, where Enlil is still king of the gods, where Marduk isn't even mentioned. These texts continued to be copied, continued to be taught, continued to circulate even after Babylon rose to dominance, as if some cities, some priests, some gods refused to accept the new order. There's also the era, epic, a text we'll examine more closely in the next section. But relevant here because Era, a plague god, is described as attacking Marduk, trying to displace him, trying to undo his supremacy. The text is complicated, difficult to interpret, but one reading is that it preserves memory of resistance to Marduk's rule, of gods who fought back, who refused to accept Babylonian theology. What was really happening beneath these theological narratives? What historical reality do they encode? The archaeological evidence is clear. Around 1800 BCE, Babylon became dominant. Under Hammurabi, the city unified much of Mesopotamia, created the first true empire. And with political dominance came theological dominance. Babylon's god had to be supreme, had to outrank the gods of conquered cities. Otherwise, how do you justify conquest? How do you maintain control? So, the Enuma Elish was written, or compiled, or propagated. A text that explained why Marduk deserved supremacy, why the old order had to change, why Babylon's dominance was cosmically justified, its sophisticated propaganda, but also sophisticated theology. It doesn't just claim Marduk is stronger, it argues he's more necessary, more functional, more capable of maintaining order. But imagine being a priest in Nippur when this theology arrived. Your city, for thousands of years, has been the religious center of Mesopotamia. Your god, Enlil, has been king of the gods. Every other city acknowledged this, brought offerings, sent representatives to the assembly. Your whole identity, your whole city's identity, is built on this cosmic centrality. And now Babylon says no, says Marduk is supreme, says Enlil is subordinate, says the old order is over. What do? Do you accept it? Do you incorporate Marduk into your theology while maintaining Enlil's importance? Do you resist? Do you reject the new texts? Do you keep teaching the old ways? The evidence suggests different cities responded differently. Some embraced the change, some adapted, some quietly resisted, and the divine world, as reflected in texts, became fragmented. Multiple theological systems coexisting, multiple hierarchies, multiple claims to supremacy, not because scribes were confused, but because the political situation was unresolved, because consensus never fully formed. The stars above Babylon showed no such revolution. Jupiter, associated with Marduk, had always been there, moving through its 12-year cycle, bright and stately. It didn't suddenly become more important when Babylon rose to power, didn't claim supremacy over other planets, just continued its patient orbit, indifferent to Babylonian theology. But priests watching Jupiter from Babylonian ziggurats invested it with new meaning, saw Marduk's supremacy reflected in Jupiter's brightness, found cosmic justification for political reality. The sky hadn't changed, but the interpretation had. The old god's stars were still there, Venus and Mars and Saturn, but now they were understood as subordinate, as lesser, as part of Marduk's cosmic order rather than equals in a divine assembly. Perhaps this theological revolution was inevitable. Perhaps when cities compete, when one dominates, when empire forms, then the dominant city's god must be elevated, must be made supreme. Otherwise, the system doesn't cohere. You can't have political unity without theological unity. Can't have one king on earth without one king in heaven. The old assembly model, with its distributed authority and democratic process, couldn't support empire, so it had to be replaced. Or perhaps the old gods never really accepted it. Perhaps beneath the official Babylonian theology, beneath the public proclamations, there was quiet resistance, continued belief in the old ways, continued teaching of the old texts, continued prayer to the old gods in their traditional roles. What looks like acceptance on the surface might hide resentment beneath. We'll never know for certain. The tablets preserve multiple perspectives, multiple theologies, multiple narratives about divine hierarchy. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the fracture was never healed. Maybe consensus was never achieved. Maybe the divine assembly, if it ever truly functioned, was permanently broken by Marduk's rise, replaced by theological diversity, by competing claims, by gods who couldn't agree on who should rule. The hidden dimension here is political, but also psychological. What does it feel like to lose supremacy? To go from central to peripheral? To watch your authority eroded? To see your sacred texts replaced? To have your city's cosmic importance diminished? The Enuma Elish doesn't tell us. It's written by the winners. But other texts, fragmentary, difficult, might preserve the loser's perspective, might show us gods who resented, who fought back, who refused to accept the new order. And that resentment, that resistance, that refusal, that's what we're exploring next, through the era epic, through a text that describes not just divine conflict, but something that sounds remarkably like divine civil war, where a god, filled with rage, attacks even Marduk himself, where cosmic order completely breaks down, where the consequences are catastrophic, the mystery deepens, the conflicts escalate, and we're approaching the texts that describe the final breakdown, the moment when whatever unity remained, whatever assembly still functioned, whatever order still held, completely shattered. There's a text that makes scholars uncomfortable, has since it was first translated in the late 1800s. It's called the Era Epic, and it describes something that, if you read it carefully, sounds less like mythology and more like war, not metaphorical war, not symbolic conflict, but something that caused actual, physical, lasting destruction. Era is a plague god, disease personified, violence incarnate, not one of the great Anunnaki, not even particularly worshipped, more feared than loved, more propitiated than celebrated. A dangerous god kept at arm's length, and the epic bearing his name describes what happens when he decides to act. The text dates to around 765 BCE, found at multiple sites, copied and recopied, considered important enough to preserve despite, or perhaps because of, its disturbing content. It begins with Era restless, bored, wanting to unleash his power. His weapons, the text says, are rusty, unused. He wants to see them gleam again, wants to feel their power, wants to do what he was made to do. But Marduk rules. Marduk maintains order, and while Marduk holds his throne, while he remains vigilant in his temple, Era can't act, can't unleash the destruction he craves. So Era uses cunning, approaches Marduk, flatters him, suggests his regalia, his royal garments, his divine symbols have become tarnished, need cleaning, need restoration. And here's the crucial moment. Marduk agrees, leaves his throne, goes to have his symbols restored. And in that absence, in that moment when cosmic authority is vacant, Era strikes. The text describes what follows in disturbing detail. Cities destroyed, populations slaughtered, fields made barren, water poisoned, the land itself contaminated. It reads like the aftermath of catastrophic war. Or, perhaps, and this is where it gets controversial, something worse. I will make the cities desolate. I will dry up the rivers. I will make people kill each other. I will make the countryside devastated. These are Era's words, his intentions, his actions, and the text doesn't shy away from describing the consequences, specific consequences, long-lasting consequences. One passage says the places Era destroys will not be settled for 40 years. 40 years, that's specific. That's not forever or a long time. That's a measured duration, as if based on observation, as if someone knew how long it took for devastated land to become habitable again. Modern scholars debate what this text preserves. The mainstream interpretation is historical catastrophe described in mythological language. Perhaps the invasions around 1200 BCE when Mesopotamia was devastated by the Sea Peoples, or the Neo-Assyrian conquests, or any of several periods when cities were destroyed and populations displaced. The Era epic in this reading is how people made sense of suffering, how they explained catastrophe, divine anger, cosmic war, its theological interpretation of historical trauma. But there's another reading, less accepted, more controversial. It asks, what if the descriptions are more literal? What if weapons that make the land uninhabitable for 40 years means, well, exactly what it sounds like? What if water that becomes poisoned isn't metaphor? What if people sickening even after the fighting stops describes actual delayed effects? This interpretation gets into dangerous territory. Ancient nuclear weapons, lost technology, catastrophic weapons that the tablets describe because they actually existed. Mainstream archaeology rejects this completely, points out that there's no physical evidence, no archaeological markers, no radiation signatures, nothing that would indicate anything beyond conventional ancient warfare. And they're right, the evidence isn't there. But the language troubles people. the specificity, the careful distinctions the text makes between different types of destruction, between immediate death and delayed death, between contaminated areas and safe areas. It reads like someone describing something they've witnessed, something they're trying to preserve accurately. Perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps ancient peoples were better observers than we give them credit for. Perhaps they noticed patterns, that certain types of destruction, from wildfire, from volcanic eruption, from disease, left land unusable for specific periods, that water sources could be poisoned in ways that took years to clear, that battlefield corpses spread disease that killed more than the battle itself. All observable phenomena, all natural explanations, but described in language that 4,000 years later sounds like something else. The Era epic also describes divine conflict beyond just Era and Marduk. Other gods are mentioned, taking sides, some supporting Era, or at least not opposing him, some trying to stop him but failing, some simply fleeing, hiding, waiting for the destruction to pass. It's not a unified divine response. It's chaos. Each god acting independently. No assembly, no collective decision, no order at all. One passage describes the Igigi, those lesser gods, watching from heaven, terrified, powerless, or unwilling to act. The text isn't clear which, but they don't intervene, don't come to humanity's aid, don't stop Era. They just watch, silent witnesses to catastrophe. The silence of the gods becomes a theme. Humanity cries out, begs for help, looks to their patron deities, but gets no answer, no divine intervention, no salvation, just continued destruction. And the text suggests this isn't because the gods don't care, but because they can't act. Because with Marduk absent, with cosmic authority vacant, even gods who want to help are powerless. Eventually Marduk returns, confronts Era, and the text describes their meeting. It's not a battle exactly, more a confrontation. Marduk angry, Era defiant, and the resolution is ambiguous. Era doesn't apologize, doesn't express regret. He justifies his actions, says the world needed correction, says chaos needed release, says order had become too rigid, too stable, too boring, and Marduk, rather than punishing Era, accepts this, reluctantly, as if recognizing that Era's rampage served some function, that periodic destruction is necessary, that order requires occasional chaos to remain vital. It's a disturbing conclusion, but perhaps a realistic one, an acknowledgement that stability and disruption, creation and destruction are both necessary, both part of cosmic function. The stars above offer no moral guidance. They shine through calm and catastrophe alike. Venus, Inanna, the goddess of both love and war. Jupiter, Marduk, the bringer of order who occasionally must step aside. Mars, associated with violence, with Nergal and Era and destruction. All visible in the same sky, all part of the same cosmos. No contradiction, no moral judgment, just existence. What mysteries remain hidden in the Era epic? What truths are encoded in language we can't quite decode? The text was copied and taught for centuries. Generation after generation of scribes considered it important, worth preserving, worth understanding. What did they know that we don't? Perhaps they recognized themselves in it, recognized the experience of catastrophe, of world order breaking down, of authority failing to protect, of destruction that seems senseless, unmotivated, unjustified. Every generation experiences this, watches systems fail, watches violence erupt, watches the world they knew disappear, and asks why, asks where the gods were, asks why protection didn't come. The era epic offers an answer, not a comforting answer, but an answer. The gods themselves conflict. Order itself is temporary. Stability requires vigilance, and when vigilance lapses, when authority vacates, when the system breaks down, then destruction follows, not as punishment, not as correction, just as consequence. We're seeing now the full scope of divine conflict the tablets preserve. From philosophical disagreement between Enlil and Enki, through territorial competition and hierarchical resentment, through the challenges to old authority by new gods, to outright violence, to destruction, to chaos unleashed. The conflicts escalated, the fractures deepened, and at some point, according to these texts, cosmic order simply collapsed. Whether this describes actual events, historical catastrophes, or purely mythological narratives created to explain human suffering, we may never fully know. Both interpretations have evidence. Both make sense. Both might be partly true. Perhaps that's the deepest mystery. That these texts can support multiple readings, can mean different things to different readers, can be both historical and mythological, both literal and symbolic, both ancient memory and timeless truth. The silence after the epic, the space between what's written and what we understand. That silence holds many secrets, and perhaps some should stay secret. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain partly hidden, known enough to wonder about, unknown enough to respect. We're moving toward questions now, toward the unresolvable tensions, toward acknowledgement of what we don't know. But first, we need to look at what these conflicts really meant, what they were really about, what interpretations exist, what theories scholars hold. That's where we're going next, to the great questions, to the competing explanations, to the space where certainty ends and wonder begins. So what were these divine conflicts actually preserving? What were the Sumerians really writing about when they described gods who couldn't agree, who competed, who fought? The question has occupied scholars for over a century, and there's no consensus, just theories, each with evidence, each with limitations, each revealing something about how we interpret ancient texts. The mainstream view is straightforward. These are mythological expressions of human political conflicts. When Lagash and Umma went to war, their gods went to war in the myths. When Babylon rose to dominance, Marduk rose to supremacy in theology. When cities competed for resources, their patron deities competed for cosmic authority, its projection. Human struggles mapped onto divine scale. The conflicts aren't describing anything supernatural. They're describing very natural human competition, resource scarcity, political rivalry, expressed through religious language. This interpretation makes sense. It has strong evidence. We can trace correlations between historical events and mythological narratives. We can see how political changes produced theological changes. We can observe that powerful cities had powerful gods, while weak cities had subordinate deities. The pattern is clear, consistent, testable against archaeological evidence. Most scholars hold this view for good reasons, but some wonder if there's more. If these texts preserve something beyond political allegory, perhaps not literally warring gods, but memory of actual catastrophes, real disasters that ancient peoples could only explain through theological frameworks. The flood narratives might remember the end of the Ice Age when seas rose and coastlines drowned. The descriptions of devastating weapons might encode memory of cometary impacts, volcanic eruptions, or widespread warfare using the most destructive technology available at the time. The divine conflicts might be how people made sense of suffering they experienced, but couldn't otherwise explain. This interpretation is more controversial. It requires accepting that oral traditions can preserve accurate details across immense time spans, thousands of years, hundreds of generations. Most scholars are skeptical. Memory degrades. Stories change in retelling. Details accumulate that weren't original. By the time something gets written down, especially something passed orally for millennia, the signal is so buried in noise that extracting historical truth becomes nearly impossible. Yet there are examples that give pause. Australian Aboriginal stories describe coastlines and landmarks that geological surveys confirm existed 10,000 years ago, but are now underwater. The details are accurate, preserved orally across 400 generations. If it happened there, could it have happened in Mesopotamia? Could stories of divine wars preserve some kernel of truth about real catastrophes from the deep past? We may never know. The evidence is ambiguous, open to interpretation, and that's uncomfortable for people who want definitive answers. Then there's the psychological reading. Carl Jung's influence, archetypes, the collective unconscious. In this view, the divine conflicts aren't about external events at all, whether historical or mythological. They're about internal human experience. Enlil versus Enki represents the eternal tension between authority and wisdom, between force and cunning, between order and creativity. These aren't external gods fighting. They're aspects of consciousness in conflict, universal human struggles projected outward as cosmic drama. This interpretation finds the conflicts meaningful precisely because they're not literal. They're metaphors for psychological truth, for the contradictions within human nature, for the choices every person faces between competing values. The Anunnaki fighting represents us fighting ourselves, our better and worse impulses, our competing loyalties, our irreconcilable desires. Perhaps there's truth in all these interpretations. Perhaps the texts work on multiple levels simultaneously. Political allegory for contemporary audiences who recognize the parallels to current events. Distorted historical memory for those preserving stories from earlier ages. Psychological metaphor for anyone recognizing universal human conflicts in divine form. Good literature does this, contains multiple meanings, speaks to different readers in different ways. Why assume ancient literature is any simpler? Some scholars take a more radical approach. They ask, what if we're missing something fundamental? What if the ME weren't just metaphors or social concepts, but actual knowledge, actual techniques, actual technology that's been lost? What if divine knowledge means knowledge that seems divine to us because we've lost it and can't reconstruct it? This gets into alternative archaeology territory, lost civilizations, ancient high technology, knowledge that predates known history. Mainstream archaeology rejects this firmly, points out there's no physical evidence, no artifacts that show technology beyond what we know ancient peoples possessed, no gaps in the archaeological record that require lost civilizations to explain. The progression from Neolithic to Bronze Age to Iron Age is clear, continuous, well documented. There's no room for advanced precursor civilizations, no need for that hypothesis. But the questions persist. How did ancient peoples move massive stones with such precision? How did they achieve astronomical knowledge that should have required instruments they didn't have? How did civilization arise so quickly in multiple places? Standard archaeology has answers. Patient observation, clever use of simple tools, massive labor forces, cultural diffusion. And these answers are probably correct, but the questions remain interesting, remain worth asking, remain provocative even if the radical answers are wrong. Maybe that's the value in these mysteries, not in resolving them definitively, but in keeping them open, in allowing multiple perspectives, in recognizing that ancient peoples were sophisticated, that we don't understand everything about them, that gaps in our knowledge create space for wonder, for humility, for acknowledging that certainty is rare and uncertainty is the more honest position. The divine conflicts might preserve political history, might encode natural disasters, might express psychological archetypes, might describe lost knowledge, might be pure fiction, might be all of these simultaneously. We don't know, can't know from the evidence available, and maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing, but wondering, but engaging seriously with ancient texts even when we can't decode them perfectly. Maybe that's more valuable than having definitive answers that close off further thought. The stars above ancient Mesopotamia offer no clarification. They shone on the scribes writing these texts, on the priests teaching them, on the students copying them, on the kings commissioning monuments, on the soldiers fighting wars, on everyone who looked up and wondered what those lights meant. And the stars offered no answers, just their patient presence, their predictable motions, their silent witness to all the questions humans asked beneath them. Perhaps the deepest truth these texts preserve is simply this: humans have always struggled with the same problems: authority and freedom, order and chaos, cooperation and competition, unity and diversity, the powerful and the powerless. These tensions are ancient, universal, enduring. The Sumerians faced them, wrote about them, tried to understand them through stories of divine conflict. And we face them still, write about them still, try to understand them still. The forms change. We don't attribute our conflicts to gods anymore. Mostly, we use different vocabulary, different frameworks, political science instead of theology, psychology instead of mythology. But the underlying struggles are the same. How do we govern ourselves? How do we distribute resources? How do we handle disagreement? How do we prevent competition from becoming violence? How do we maintain order without crushing freedom? The tablets don't answer these questions, but they show us people grappling with them 5,000 years ago. Show us sophisticated thinking about power and conflict and governance. Show us recognition that even the best systems fail, that even divine assemblies deadlock. That consensus is hard and maybe impossible when interests truly diverge. That's wisdom worth preserving, worth translating, worth thinking about, especially if we can't be certain what the texts originally meant. We may never fully understand why the Anunnaki turned against each other, may never know what historical reality, if any, these myths preserve, may never resolve whether they're political allegory, distorted memory, psychological metaphor, encoded knowledge, or pure creative fiction. The mystery endures, the ambiguity persists, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps mystery itself has value, teaches humility, encourages continued inquiry, keeps us wondering. There's something the Sumerians seem to have understood that we sometimes forget, that certain tensions can't be resolved, that some conflicts are structural, built into any system of governance, any society, any attempt to organize collective life, not failures of design, but inherent contradictions that persist regardless of how carefully you construct your hierarchy, your assembly, your divine order. The Enlil-Enki divide illustrates this. authority versus wisdom, power versus cunning, force versus subtlety. These aren't just personality differences, they're fundamentally different approaches to governance. And both have merit. Both are necessary, but they can't be reconciled. If Enlil acts, Enki objects. If Enki schemes, Enlil disapproves. The assembly can vote, but the loser won't truly accept defeat. Will find workarounds, will subvert, will resist. Not out of stubbornness, but out of genuine conviction that their approach is correct. Perhaps the Sumerians, in creating gods who couldn't agree, were acknowledging something profound, that there is no perfect system, no set of rules that satisfies everyone, no authority structure that eliminates conflict. You can have democratic assemblies, but they deadlock. You can have strong central authority, but it becomes tyrannical. You can distribute power, but coordination fails. Every solution creates new problems. Every answer generates new questions. Some scholars suggest the divine conflicts reflect the fundamental impossibility of unity in diversity. Sumer was never one nation. It was independent city-states with shared culture, but competing interests. Each city needed autonomy, but they also needed cooperation, shared water systems, trade networks, common defense against outside threats. How do you get independent entities to work together when their interests conflict? The divine assembly was supposed to solve this, but it couldn't, not really, because unity requires subordinating local interests to collective good. And asking people, or gods, to do that consistently is asking too much. Maybe this is why territorial gods fought. Why Ningirsu and Shara couldn't coexist peacefully. Their cities needed the same water, claimed the same land, competed for the same trade routes. There was no solution that satisfied both. One had to dominate, or both had to accept less than they wanted, and neither was willing. So they fought, and the divine realm reflected earthly reality. Or earthly reality reflected divine inevitability. Either way, the conflict couldn't be resolved without one side losing, without inequality, without hierarchy that breeds resentment. The hierarchy itself was a source of unresolvable tension. The Igigi rebelled because being subordinate is inherently frustrating. Being told what to do, being made to labor while others rest, being essential but unappreciated. You can restructure. You can create humans to do the work. You can redistribute responsibilities. But as long as some have authority and others don't, as long as some give orders and others follow, the tension persists, maybe diminished, maybe managed, but never eliminated. Others suggest the problem is deeper, that the conflicts represent the impossibility of static perfection. The Enuma Elish describes Apsu wanting quiet, wanting things to stop changing, stop developing. The younger gods were too noisy, too active, too disruptive. But life is noise. Growth is disruption. Change is constant. You can't have vitality and silence simultaneously. Can't have development and stasis. Apsu's desire for quiet was a desire for death. And when he tried to impose it, he was killed. Because life won't be silenced, won't stop, won't accept perfect order. Perhaps that's what the Era epic is really about. Not literal destruction, but necessary disruption. Marduk establishes order, but order, if too rigid, becomes sterile, becomes dead. So, Era, chaos personified, must occasionally break things, must introduce disorder, must remind everyone that stability is temporary, that creation requires destruction, that life includes death. It's not comfortable, not pleasant, but necessary, unresolvable, built into the nature of existence. We may never know if the Sumerians consciously intended these philosophical depths. Maybe they did. Maybe they were just telling stories and the depth is our projection. But the texts support these readings, reward this level of analysis, suggest sophisticated thinking about problems that remain unsolved today. Modern political science recognizes many of the same tensions: federalism versus centralization, individual rights versus collective good, free markets versus regulation, democracy versus efficiency. Every political system is a compromise, a balance, an attempt to navigate contradictions that can't be fully resolved. You choose where to place the balance point, but you can't eliminate the tension, can't have both sides completely satisfied, can't achieve perfect harmony when legitimate values conflict. Maybe seeing this pattern in ancient texts is comforting somehow. It suggests these aren't new problems, aren't failures of modern society. They're ancient, fundamental, maybe eternal. Humans have struggled with them for 5,000 years at least, probably longer. We'll struggle with them for 5,000 more. And knowing we're part of a long line of people wrestling with the same contradictions, that removes some pressure, some sense of unique failure. We're just continuing a very old conversation. The stars offer no solutions. They move through their patterns without conflict, without debate, without assembly or vote. Jupiter doesn't argue with Mars. Venus doesn't compete with Saturn. They just follow physical laws, perfect celestial mechanics. But we're not stars. We have wills, interests, values, and those collide, create conflicts that can't be resolved through calculation or consensus, can only be navigated, managed, endured. Perhaps the greatest wisdom the Sumerian tablets preserve is simply acknowledging this, not claiming to have solved these tensions, but admitting they exist, not promising harmony, but describing discord, not offering easy answers, but presenting hard questions. That's honest. That's realistic. That's more valuable than false promises of perfect systems that history repeatedly shows don't work. The divine assembly failed. The hierarchy bred resentment. The territorial gods fought. Marduk's supremacy was contested. Era brought chaos. The whole system fractured and maybe never really worked. But somehow, despite all this dysfunction, civilization continued, cities thrived, culture developed, knowledge accumulated, humans built, created, persisted, as if divine conflict didn't prevent human achievement, as if we could succeed despite cosmic disorder, or maybe because of it, maybe the chaos, the competition, the conflict. That's what drove innovation, adaptation, resilience. We may never know what the Anunnaki conflicts really mean, but we can observe that the Sumerians, living with these stories, living within theology that admitted divine dysfunction, didn't despair, didn't give up, didn't conclude that if the gods couldn't agree, then humans were doomed. They kept building, kept writing, kept teaching, kept copying these texts generation after generation, finding value in them, finding truth, finding something worth preserving. And maybe that's the lesson, that you can acknowledge unresolvable tensions without becoming paralyzed, can recognize that systems fail without abandoning systems, can admit that conflict is inevitable without accepting that violence is necessary, can live with mystery, with uncertainty, with competing truths, and still build something meaningful, still create culture, still preserve knowledge, still pass forward to the next generation something worth having. The tablets endure. Clay pressed 5,000 years ago, still speaking, still asking questions, still preserving the Sumerian struggle with governance. with conflict, with the impossibility of perfect order. And we listen, wonder, see ourselves reflected in their struggles, find their questions still relevant, their conflicts still resonant, their honesty still valuable. Perhaps mystery is gift. Perhaps not knowing is opportunity. Perhaps the unresolvable tensions, rather than being problems to solve, are simply conditions to navigate, realities to accept, truths to acknowledge. And in that acknowledgement, in that acceptance, there's a kind of peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of understanding, of recognizing what is, of not demanding what can't be. The cities fell. Sumer itself, the first urban civilization, collapsed around 2000 BCE. Invasions, climate change, salinization of fields. The whole system that had functioned for over 1,000 years simply stopped working. The great cities emptied, the temples abandoned, the people scattered, and you might think the stories would disappear with them, that divine conflicts would be forgotten when the civilization that created them ended. But that's not what happened, because the Akkadians, who conquered Sumer, who spoke a different language, who came from the north, they didn't destroy Sumerian literature. They preserved it, translated it, made it their own. They learned to read Sumerian the way we learn Latin, as a classical language, dead but essential, no longer spoken but still containing wisdom worth accessing. So the texts continued. The Akkadian scribes copied the Sumerian tablets, taught them in schools, maintained the library collections, the stories of the Anunnaki, of Enlil and Enki, of divine assembly and divine conflict. All of it passed forward, changed somewhat, translated, adapted to new theological needs, but fundamentally preserved. The conflicts that fractured the Sumerian divine world became conflicts in the Babylonian divine world. Same tensions, same unresolvable contradictions, different names sometimes, but same struggles. Even now, when you visit museums, you can see this continuity. Tablets from Babylon, from Assyria, from cities that rose long after Sumer fell, all containing Sumerian narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in both languages. The Atrahasis epic, the creation myths, the flood stories, the divine assembly texts, all copied, preserved, taught for over 2,000 years after the culture that created them disappeared. Still today, scholars are discovering new tablets, new versions of known texts, new fragments that fill gaps in narratives we thought we understood. The vast majority of cuneiform tablets in museums haven't been fully studied yet. They sit in storage, in archives, waiting for someone with the expertise and time to translate them, to add them to the corpus, to reveal what else the ancient scribes preserved. And what they preserved, at its core, is the recognition that divine governance was messy, that authority was contested, that even gods struggled with the same problems humans struggle with. This wasn't secret knowledge, wasn't hidden doctrine. It was mainstream, taught in schools, copied in temple libraries, accepted as fundamental truth about how the cosmos worked. The biblical tradition encountered these stories directly. Jewish scribes, during the Babylonian exile, 586-538 BCE, lived in Babylon, learned the language, read the tablets, and when they wrote Genesis, when they composed their own creation accounts, they engaged with Mesopotamian material, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes inverting the meaning, but always aware of it, always in conversation with it. The flood narrative in Genesis is clearly related to the Sumerian original. Same basic story, same boat, same animals, Same divine decision to destroy humanity, same survival, but with crucial differences. In Genesis, one God decides, one God regrets, one God saves. The assembly disappears, the divine conflict vanishes. Unity replaces discord. It's a deliberate theological revision, taking Mesopotamian material and reshaping it to serve monotheistic purposes. But here's what's remarkable. Even though Genesis removes the divine conflict, the conflict itself was preserved elsewhere, in later Jewish texts, in Christian interpretations, in Islamic traditions. The idea of war in heaven, of angels falling, of Satan rebelling, these aren't biblical inventions. They're developments of earlier Mesopotamian ideas about divine discord. The Igigi rebellion becomes the fall of the angels. The conflicts among the Anunnaki become the war between God and Satan. Different theological framework, different names, but similar recognition that even cosmic authority faces challenges. Perhaps this is why the Mesopotamian material matters. Not because it's literally true, not because gods really fought, but because it preserves sophisticated thinking about power, about conflict, about governance. Thinking that influenced everything that came after. That's embedded in Western theology, Western philosophy, Western political thought. We're still wrestling with questions the Sumerians asked 5,000 years ago, still trying to solve problems they acknowledged were unresolvable. Even now, in the 21st century, scholars continue debating what these texts mean. New translations appear, new interpretations, new archaeological discoveries that change understanding. The conversation continues. The tablets keep speaking. The ancient voices remain part of our intellectual heritage. Still today, when we see political deadlock, when we watch assemblies fail to reach consensus, when we observe competing authorities that can't agree, we're seeing the same patterns the Sumerians described. Democracy is difficult. Hierarchy breeds resentment. Distributed power creates coordination problems. Centralized authority becomes tyrannical. Every solution generates new issues. The tensions are structural, ancient, persistent. The stars above us are the same stars the Sumerians watched. The constellations unchanged. Venus still rises as evening star and morning star. Jupiter still moves through its stately orbit. The sky patterns that ancient priests tracked with such precision are still there, still predictable, still reliable. While below, human governance remains as messy as ever, as contested, as unresolved. Perhaps that contrast is what the Sumerians were pointing to. The heavens orderly, the earth chaotic, the gods struggling just as humans struggle. No easy answers, no perfect systems, just continuous effort to make things work, to navigate conflicts that can't be fully eliminated, to build despite dysfunction, to create meaning despite uncertainty. The legacy isn't a solution, it's a recognition, an acknowledgement that the problems are hard, that governance is difficult, that unity is fragile, that conflict is inevitable, but also that civilization continues anyway, that humans persist, that knowledge accumulates, that culture develops despite, maybe because of, the tensions and contradictions and unresolvable conflicts. We carry this legacy forward, whether we know it or not, whether we've read the tablets or not. The questions the Sumerians asked, we're still asking. The conflicts they described, we're still experiencing. The wisdom they preserved, we're still needing, not as dogma, not as doctrine, but as honest acknowledgement of how difficult collective existence really is. And the tablets themselves, those humble clay objects, continue to exist in museums, in universities, in private collections, physical objects that have outlasted empires, outlasted languages, outlasted belief systems, still here, still readable, still offering their ancient perspective to anyone willing to engage seriously with them. The story continues, not as the Sumerians told it, not with the same gods or the same cities or the same theology, but as ongoing human struggle with the same fundamental tensions: authority and freedom, unity and diversity, order and chaos, cooperation and competition. These aren't solved, can't be solved, can only be navigated. And knowing that people 5,000 years ago knew it deeply, knew it enough to write it into their foundational myths, that's somehow comforting. We're not alone in our struggles, not unique in our conflicts, not the first to face impossible choices between competing goods. The Sumerians were there before us, wrestling with the same contradictions, and they left us their thoughts, their questions, their honest admission that even the gods couldn't figure it out. And maybe that's the real gift, not answers, not solutions, not promises of harmony, just company, just the knowledge that this has always been hard, that we're part of a very long conversation, that the questions endure even when civilizations fall, that wonder persists even when certainty fails, that mystery, rather than being frustrating, can be generative, can open space for continued thought, continued dialogue, continued human effort to understand ourselves and each other. The ancient voices still speak, if we listen, if we're patient, if we're willing to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity, and texts that resist definitive interpretation. They speak, and what they say is still worth hearing, still relevant, still true in ways that transcend the specific culture that produced them. And so we return to this moment, to wherever you are right now, to the quiet darkness that surrounds you, to your breathing, slow and steady, to the simple fact of being here, listening, resting. The Anunnaki fought, according to the tablets, according to 5,000 years of preserved narrative. They disagreed, competed, turned against each other. The divine assembly fractured. The cosmic order that was supposed to govern everything broke down, or never really worked in the first place. The texts don't give us certainty, just questions. Just the record of conflicts that mirror human struggles so closely that we can't tell whether gods created humans in their image or humans created gods in theirs. The stars above you tonight, wherever you are the same stars the Sumerians watched from their ziggurats, the same lights that ancient priests tracked with such precision. Venus moves through her cycle as she always has. Jupiter follows his stately orbit. The moon waxes and wanes. The patterns haven't changed, won't change. The sky is orderly, predictable, reliable. But here on Earth, we're still struggling with the same tensions, still trying to govern ourselves, still facing conflicts between authority and wisdom, between unity and diversity, between order and freedom. The Anunnaki's problems are our problems. Their conflicts are our conflicts. And maybe that's the deepest truth these ancient texts preserve. Not literal accounts of divine warfare, but honest acknowledgement that these tensions are ancient, fundamental, maybe unresolvable. And you know what? That's okay. That doesn't have to be depressing, because the Sumerians lived with that knowledge, built their civilization with it, created art, literature, mathematics, astronomy, law, codes, elaborate systems of governance, all while believing their gods couldn't agree, all while acknowledging that cosmic order was fragile. That authority was contested. That harmony was impossible. They persisted anyway, built anyway, created anyway, and their work survived. The tablets endure. The knowledge passed forward. The questions still resonate. 5,000 years later, we're still reading their words, still wondering about their meaning, still finding ourselves reflected in their struggles. The clay tablets rest in museums now, in climate-controlled archives, behind glass. The wedge marks pressed so long ago still visible, still readable. The scribes who made them are dust. The cities they lived in are ruins. The gods they worshipped are no longer believed in, at least not in the same way. But the tablets remain, patient, silent, waiting for each new generation to discover them, to translate them, to wonder about them. Perhaps mystery is a gift. Perhaps not. Knowing is better than false certainty. Perhaps acknowledging that some tensions can't be resolved is wiser than promising solutions that don't exist. The Sumerians knew this, wrote it down, made it foundational to their theology. And maybe that's why their civilization, despite its conflicts, despite its eventual collapse, left such a profound legacy. The wind moves across the Iraqi desert tonight, over the tells that were once great cities, over Ur and Uruk and Nippur, over the buried temples and the excavated ruins and the sites that haven't been explored yet. The same wind that moved over them 5,000 years ago, carrying dust, carrying seeds, carrying time itself forward into whatever comes next. And somewhere, always, someone is listening to these old stories. Someone is translating a newly discovered tablet. Someone is teaching a class about Sumerian literature. Someone is wondering about the Anunnaki. Someone is recognizing themselves in these ancient conflicts. The conversation continues. The questions persist. The tablets still speak. Your breathing is slow now, steady. The night is deep. And beneath all the questions, beneath all the conflicts, beneath all the uncertainty about what these texts really mean or what really happened 5,000 years ago, there's something simple, something certain, something that doesn't require interpretation. You exist, right now, in this moment, part of the same cosmos the Sumerians wondered about, under the same stars they watched, facing some of the same questions they asked. And that continuity, that connection across time, that shared struggle with existence and meaning and how to live together, that's real, that's solid, that matters. The Anunnaki turned against each other, or humans imagined gods turning against each other to make sense of their own conflicts, or both, or neither, or something we haven't thought of yet. The mystery endures. The ambiguity persists. And that's all right. Because the real story isn't about certainty. It's about wonder, about curiosity, about being willing to sit with questions that don't have easy answers, about engaging seriously with ancient voices, especially when we can't be sure what they're really saying. The tablets wait in their silence. The stars wheel through their patterns. The wind moves on. And somewhere in that stillness, in that patience, in that continuity of sky and earth and human wondering, everything continues, not resolved, not answered, not finished, just continuing. The way it always has, the way it always will, quietly, patiently, endlessly.